Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host. The y'all mean of revolution. Maduro stands strong. Venezuelan revolution lives on. Trump grows angry, but he's afraid. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution? Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. What they imperialist plan is all going to hell. Trump is embarrassed. Europe turning against Trump. Russia and China is ready to attack. Let's get into the content. Salute. I'm playing with you. Yeah. The world is tired of playing with the imperialists, man. This is like a bad movie, bad dream. The empire's from the fall. Zelensky, I told you, I finna kidnap Zelensky. He next.
Is the United States above the law? Dmitry Medvedev calls the capture of Nicolas Maduro a perfect example of American peacekeeping, a military raid in a sovereign nation that posed no threat to Washington. Medvedev mocked the operation, saying Maduro and his wife were seized legally and in coordination with Congress, while Europe stayed almost completely silent.
A perfect example of U.S. peacekeeping. A hard military operation in an independent country that posed no threat whatsoever to the United States. The seizure by special forces of a legally elected president together with his wife. Of course, all of this strictly within the framework of international law and domestic legislation, in coordination with Congress. Almost complete silence from democratic Europe. Guaranteed love in Latin America, where the Monroe Doctrine is extremely popular. In short, another brilliant step toward the Nobel Prize.
He went further, sarcastically claiming, the U.S. will now enjoy guaranteed love in Latin America, and called the operation another brilliant step toward the Nobel Prize. Turning to Ukraine, Medvedev lashed out. He described Kyiv's leadership as trained animals, running wild, ignoring Washington, and provocatively suggested U.S. forces could storm Ukrainian military bases to capture them.
Trump should have shown the same level of energy as in Venezuela, somewhere entirely different. The trained Ukrainian animals coked up in Kiev have completely gotten out of hand. They've stopped listening to the ringmaster of the circus. The example of Venezuela is unlikely to sober them up. Still, it would be nice if the U.S. attacked the military bases of Banderistan and American special forces captured the gang of drug addicts on Bankova Street. Maybe it's time already, Uncle Sam?
According to Medvedev, Venezuela proves a brutal lesson. Any state that fails to maximize its military strength risks having its government overthrown by foreign powers chasing oil or power. He left no ambiguity. Maximum strengthening means nuclear weapons, ending with a chilling declaration, long live nuclear weapons.
The operation in Caracas became the best proof of the fact that any state must strengthen its armed forces to the maximum, not allowing various rich, arrogant actors to casually change the constitutional order in search of oil or something else. And maximum strengthening that guarantees reliable protection of a country means only one thing: a nuclear arsenal. Long live nuclear weapons!
His words come after Trump claimed the U.S. is now in charge of Venezuela, tying Caracas, Kyiv, and nuclear deterrence into a single threatening narrative, a provocative blueprint for global realpolitik. A single arrest in Caracas is now echoing across global fault lines. President Donald Trump's capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro has triggered a coordinated pushback from Moscow and Beijing to missile launches by North Korea near a key U.S. ally, Japan. Russia was the first to respond, condemning the U.S. military operation as an act of armed aggression. Moscow accused Washington of abandoning diplomacy, warning that Trump's action risks destabilizing an already fragile global order. A close ally of the Maduro government, Russia, called for an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council, urging restraint and dialogue, even as it framed the move as part of a wider pattern of American coercion.
This morning, the United States carried out an act of armed aggression against Venezuela. This causes deep concern and condemnation, Russia said in a statement from its foreign ministry. The pretexts cited to justify such actions are unfounded. Ideologized hostility has prevailed over practical pragmatism and over a willingness to build relations based on trust and predictability.
China quickly aligned with Moscow, urging the United States to immediately release Maduro and his wife and to guarantee their safety. Beijing said it was deeply shocked by what it called America's blatant use of force.
China is deeply shocked and strongly condemns the U.S.'s blatant use of force against a sovereign state and its action against its president. Such hegemonic behavior by the U.S. seriously violates international law, infringes upon Venezuela's sovereignty, and threatens peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean. China firmly opposes it.
Chinese officials accused the Trump administration of violating international law and undermining sovereignty, warning that efforts to forcibly change governments threaten peace across Latin America and beyond. Kim escalates. As diplomatic anger grew, North Korea raised the stakes. Pyongyang fired a suspected ballistic missile toward the East Sea, triggering emergency alerts in Japan, a clear signal amid rising tensions with Washington. South Korea and Japan confirmed the launch, while the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command said the missile posed no immediate threat, even as Kim Jong-un continues to ramp up weapons testing. With Putin condemning, Xi demanding release, and Kim launching missiles near a U.S. ally, Trump's seizure of Maduro is reshaping global alignments, turning a Latin American operation into a worldwide geopolitical showdown.
Who we're very, very honored to have here on the show, and that is Dr. Vijay Prashad, the Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute. Vijay, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a strange day today.
It is. And I think, Rania, I don't know, I think you wanted to play a clip for Vijay, I believe, to open and ask a question, so I'll kick it to you.
Hello, Vijay, from what you call the other side of imperialism. As everyone knows, I'm based over here in Lebanon, which has been the subject of a lot of U.S. bombs over the last couple of years, and now I'm watching the U.S. do it to Venezuela. We warned about this. We've talked about this. Now it's happening. They've kidnapped the president of Venezuela. It's quite insane to witness all this insanity. But Trump got even more insane, VJ. I'm sure you watched the press conference that he gave addressing the nation over what he and his administration just did. And he made some claims about what he planned to do. I want to play that clip, and then I want to ask you some questions about it, VJ.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
Yeah, right.
And it has.
This clown is finished.
So there you have it. We're going to run the country, but Trump has yet to give any clarity about what that means. The press did a terrible job of asking for clarity about that after him and his administration officials spoke. I mean, I'm just sitting here, VJ, watching that. You know, you've covered so many U.S. wars, including the occupation of Iraq. If you want to run the Venezuelan government, run a country of 30 million people, you're going to have to put tens of thousands, if not like 100,000 U.S. soldiers on the ground and occupy it, because Venezuela is full of millions of people who are pro-revolution, who are Chavistas, and who certainly won't roll over and just allow Trump or America to run their country or, you know, give them their oil for free. So I'm just curious your thoughts on the idea of the U.S. running the Venezuelan government, as Trump said, and staying. He used the word staying until a safe transition has been reached.
Well, the most important part of that statement is the acknowledgement that the preferred heir, Maria Corina Machado, who was given the Nobel Peace Prize last year, is not ready to take over. I mean, that is a real slap against the Venezuelan opposition. And one of the interesting bits of timing is the Venezuelan National Assembly is to reconvene on the 5th of January. The election was held in May last year. That assembly sits from 2026 to 2031. And the opposition in the assembly is led by veteran opposition politician Henry Capriles. I think there's an understanding that when that opposition comes into the assembly, Capriles dislikes Maria Corina Machado. The opposition once again is going to fray. The United States not prepared to risk its fortunes on a fractious opposition. So Mr. Trump is saying something that he said, in fact, in criticism of George W. Bush at the time when the United States overthrew the government of Saddam Hussein. What he said was why didn't the United States just go in and take the oil? Why didn't the United States go in and run the country directly and just pay for the occupation with the oil money? I mean, that was his criticism of George W. Bush. People misunderstand that, saying Mr. Trump was against wars. No American president has been against a war. The legal justification, and I use the word legal really very, very ironically, not in a way that's alongside international law, but the U.S. legal justification for all this was set by Barack Obama in 2015 when he signed an executive order on Venezuela. So Mr. Trump is basically just saying, I'd do Venezuela, which Barack Obama has basically said is legal for the United States to come in and do what it wants. I'd do it better than George W. Bush did it in Iraq. Now, you asked a very important question. Does the United States have the internal ability to actually send enough people to go and then colonize Venezuela? I think that's the history has shown us. United States very good at bombing countries. Indeed, very good even at going in and snatching a leader. It's not the first time in Latin America. They did that already with Manuel Noriega in 1989 in Panama. The United States very good at destroying countries, very bad at governing them. It showed that in Afghanistan, showed that in Iraq. United States didn't even try in Syria, handed it over to Al-Qaeda. didn't even try in Libya. I doubt very much they'll try in Venezuela. I think these are empty words from Mr. Trump. But I have to be very cautious about saying that, because a lot of things Trump says sound like empty words, and then he goes ahead and does it anyway. So they may try to govern Venezuela, but it'll end up a worse fiasco for them than Iraq.
You know, Vijay, I think you bring up a lot of really important points. And one element is that, yeah, of course, this has happened before in terms of the US going in and snatching presidents, but actually doing direct military strikes on South America is unprecedented. And even in the military buildup that we saw since August, the strikes on boats in the Caribbean, it still seemed like they won't actually do something against, a land strike against Venezuela, but they have. And it is an unprecedented moment. Why Venezuela and why now? And for you, what is next? Does this open the door to more attacks like this?
Well, I mean, if you read Trump's national security strategy, it's really laid out very clearly. Trump basically says there that the rest of the world is going to be hard for the United States to directly control. But the Western Hemisphere, what they call the Western Hemisphere, must be taken in hand. And there Trump directly writes again the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, the doctrine against Bolivarianism. By Bolivarianism, I mean the original Simon Bolivar, the original fellow in the 1810s. The Monroe Doctrine said that the Bolivarian push across Latin America had to be put back in the bottle. And Trump in 2025 says that there's a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Trump corollary is use whatever force you want, whatever means you want, exercise the Monroe Doctrine. It's very interesting you bring up the boats in the Caribbean. I was, for whatever reason, awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, Santiago time, and I was texting with people in Caracas. In fact, somebody live streamed the bombing with me. It was a very surreal moment, I would say. I felt very awkward about seeing that in that way. But at any rate, when I was watching that, the first thing that crossed my mind was my sense that when the United States announced that they had moved their E-8 growlers, E-18G growlers, to Puerto Rico. These are electronic jamming aircrafts. When they had moved these aircrafts to Puerto Rico, I read that report in one of the Stars and Stripes magazines, and I thought, well, that's interesting, but I wonder what's going on. Well, look, they have the most sophisticated electronic jamming systems, the ALQ-249. That's the most publicly available one. It's very likely that the United States, whose military power is frequently underestimated, have the capacity to just paralyze all kinds of air defense systems. I always found Seymour Hersh's article about the capture of Osama bin Laden in 2011 to be a little off. I don't really think that the Pakistani military allowed themselves to be so badly humiliated. I think the United States had jamming systems in place. They sent in those 2 Black Hawk helicopters, grabbed bin Laden and came out. Very similar operation here, by the way, except they did it with a lot more noise, a lot more distracting bombardments in different parts of the country. They knew exactly where Mr. Maduro was. They know exactly where everybody is. For God's sake, people, wake up. The Israelis knew where all mid-level Hezbollah people were, and they blew up their pagers. I mean, their electronic systems should never be underestimated. Imperialism has incredible power to destroy. Beyond that, what they will do, one doesn't know. This is part of their ability to exercise the Monroe Doctrine. They want to destabilize Venezuela. They would like this government to be weakened now. They would like to see some sort of transition. They would like to see this have a knock-on effect, which is that the governments of Nicaragua and Cuba sort of self-immolate without Venezuela in the picture. That's what they'd like to see. Already, there are right-wing governments all across South America, right-wing governments creeping up Central America, including in Honduras. by hook or by crook in Honduras and in the Caribbean. The very fact that the government of Trinidad and Tobago, with a semi-center right prime minister, then turns out in this last phase to be a complete imperialist, is an extraordinary moment. We are seeing the death of the pink tide, and in this case being killed off, and the birth of the angry tide. Imagine what you must feel like to be Jose Antonio Cast in Chile, waiting to be inaugurated, watching the United States do this in Venezuela. You feel like now in Chile, you can do anything. Nayib Bukele in El Salvador is watching this on television, saying, now I can do anything. And there's elections this year in both Brazil and in Colombia. And I tell you something, people should not be too comfortable about the fact that Gustavo Petro is the president of Colombia. He cannot run again. You can't by Colombian law. But the next president of Colombia might well be Vicky Davila. And God help the Colombian people. In Brazil, people are feeling like, oh, there's no way that Lula can lose. I don't think you should be so confident that Lula can win. And even if Lula does win, the Senate will be captured by the Bolsonaristas. That means from as low down as the southern cone all the way up to the border of Mexico, you have a fire-breathing right wing in power, and getting rid of Nicolas Maduro in this brutal, illegal way is just one small way to move a piece on a chessboard. And Mr. Trump, exercising the Monroe Doctrine through the Trump corollary, is pushing U.S. power in a way we haven't seen, at least not in my lifetime.
No, I think those are extraordinarily important points, Vijay. And I think to talk about the geopolitical nature of it, not simply just an issue over resources, but the use and distribution of resources to help people, and how the U.S. does not want that in any context. And, maybe we can, they're dressing the whole thing up with the drugs thing, but I would say over the past couple months, they've been pretty open themselves. I want to try to bring up a tweet from Stephen Miller that I think is important. And he says, American sweat, ingenuity, and toil created the oil industry in Venezuela. Its tyrannical expropriation was the largest recorded theft of American wealth and property, blah, 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 blah. I don't want to give him too much airtime. But the reason I wanted to bring this up specifically, Vijay, is because this is the exact same argument that the British made about Mossadegh in Iran, that we built the oil industry in Iran and thus it belongs to us and they have no right to nationalize it. And I guess I just want your thoughts on that, what to me seems amazing, confluence here of colonialist logic.
Well, firstly, it's very important to say that Hugo Chavez's first government did not nationalize the oil. It's important to say he wins the presidential election in 1998 with a mandate to improve the people's condition of life. They pass a new constitution in 1999, mandating improve the people's life. And then there's a democratic constitution, democratic law passed in 2001, the hydrocarbons law, which says that Venezuela should have more say over the surplus based on the oil extracted. Chevron understands that they're playing ball and decides to negotiate with the Venezuelan government. ExxonMobil goes nuts about this, and Canadian mining companies, Barrick Gold, led by Peter Monk. Peter Monk writes in the Canadian press saying Hugo Chavez should be overthrown. There's a coup attempt against Chavez in 2002, right after the hydrocarbons law. It's not you don't need Stephen Miller around to say these things. Stephen Miller is a moron. This has been a long-standing part of US policy, that this oil is US oil. Why should ExxonMobil's oil have been taken? And remember, Trump's first Secretary of State was Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil. And it was actually Rex Tillerson who engineers ExxonMobil's confrontation between Guyana and Venezuela over the Essequibo region. They've been angry about this for a very long time. They want that oil back. And it's important to tell people who are going to go and say silly things on social media, the United States doesn't need oil. It's an oil exporter. The United States wants to control the oil. The United States wants to control the oil. It's a supremely important resource. And also, they don't want the Bolivarian revolution to be using the oil to improve the conditions of life for people in the Caribbean through PetroCarib, which for a brief period of time helped the people of Haiti. They don't want the proceeds of the oil to be used to help left-wing movements across Latin America, indeed around the world. Don't forget that it was Hugo Chavez who in 2003 said, we don't want no US imperialism, the first time after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Hugo Chavez joining Fidel Castro in a global campaign against imperialism. Meanwhile, it was in fact about 6-7 years later for us to listen to the Russians and the Chinese say we don't want a single master in the world. Chavez was saying this 2003, goes to the United Nations and says, I can smell sulfur here after George W. Bush has spoken. Now, it's important to remember that what Stephen Miller tweets, this is our oil, we want it back, has been the basis of US policy from the 2001 hydrocarbon law to the present. Extraordinarily consistent policy that has gone from the administrations of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, blah, blah, blah.
Do you want to, Zoe, before we let Vijay go, do you want to top that off with anything?
I mean, Vijay says it all. And I think I really encourage everyone to read his report that he wrote with Taroa Zuniga. Also, Vijay, your reports on the angry tide. I think we really have to situate ourselves in exactly what you're saying and the fact that the region is changing rapidly and the politics of the region are changing rapidly. And we have to take it seriously.
I just want to make a quick plug for Hyperimperialism, the study done by Tricontinental that I think gives critical background. So go to the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and check out all that work.
Well, it's so great to be with you guys again. What a day. Nicolas Maduro is my friend. I feel terribly for him. When he was told by Hugo Chavez, Nicolas, you have to take over after I'm dead, Nicolas Maduro started crying and saying, nobody can take over from you. Please don't put this mantle on me. He's an extremely humble man. He enters politics as a union leader of the bus drivers. He himself was a bus driver. Then he goes off and becomes a politician because Chavez found him in the union movement, becomes a foreign minister. He is a reluctant politician, and I feel terribly for him as a person. There is nothing in his character that suggests this kind of treatment of him. And I really want to say that, guys, because I know that lots of people on the left will turn their back on Nicolas Maduro Moro and Celia Flores, and I refuse to do so.
Yes, no, absolutely. And we appreciate everything you bring to the table, Vijay, and everything that
The United Nations Security Council has just concluded its special session on the illegal attack on Venezuela's sovereignty by the rogue regime of Donald Trump. As I said, the American invasion of Venezuela has conclusively confirmed the demise of the United Nations, the body which came into being or which was established to ensure that no rogue nation could ever endanger the sovereignty of another nation after the Second World War, has become a laughingstock now. We saw its disgraceful inaction during the Gaza Holocaust, and we are now seeing its total irrelevance in the wake of the attack on Venezuela and the kidnapping of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. But even at the United Nations Security Council today, the US found itself completely isolated. This clearly rattled the representative from the rogue regime of Donald Trump, so much so that the American ambassador ended up repeating the ugly truth right in front of everyone else. He said that the primary objective was to illegally usurp the vast natural resources, primarily the oil reserves of Venezuela.
This is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. You can't turn Venezuela into the operating hub for Iran, for Hezbollah, for gangs, for Cuban intelligence agents, and other malign actors that control that country. You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries of the United States, under the control of illegitimate leaders.
The Venezuelan representative also spoke on the occasion. He told the world that it was the greed of criminals running the US regime that was responsible for the utter disdain for rule-based world order.
In 2004, the International Court of Justice affirmed that occupation exists when a state exercises effective control, even without formal annexation or the continuous presence of troops. Security Council Resolution 242, for its part, emphasizes that the acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible, while General Assembly Resolution 2625 establishes that the territory of a state shall not be subject to military occupation as a result of the use of force in contravention of the UN Charter. Allowing such acts to go without an effective answer would amount to normalizing the replacement of law by might, while eroding the very foundations of the collective security system. Today, it is not only Venezuela's sovereignty that is at stake, the credibility of international law, the authority of this organization, and the validity of the principle that no state can set itself up as a judge, party, and executor of the world order are also at stake. Mr. President, we cannot ignore a central element of this US aggression. Venezuela is the victim of these attacks because of its natural resources. Our country's oil, energy, strategic resources, and geopolitical position have historically been factors of greed and external pressure.
American expert Jeffrey Sachs, who has been vocal against the US support for the Gaza Holocaust, too was invited to share his thoughts. You have to watch what he said and how he exposed the imperialist agenda of the US government. I will post his full speech separately, but you should watch a short clip here.
Since 1947, the United States foreign policy has repeatedly employed force, covert action, and political manipulation to bring about regime change in other countries. This is a matter of carefully documented historical record. In her book, Covert Regime Change, political scientist Lindsay O'Rourke documents 70 attempted U.S. regime change operations between 1947 and 1989 alone. These practices did not end with the Cold War. Since 1989, major United States regime change operations undertaken without authorization by the Security Council have included, among the most consequential, Iraq 2003, Libya 2011, Syria beginning in 2011, Honduras 2009, Ukraine 2014, and Venezuela from 2002 onward. The methods employed are well established and well documented. They include open warfare, covert intelligence operations, instigation of unrest, support for armed groups, manipulation of mass and social media, bribery of military and civilian officials, targeted assassinations, false flag operations, and economic warfare. These measures are illegal under the UN Charter, and they typically result in ongoing violence, lethal conflict, political instability, and deep suffering of the civilian population. The recent U.S. record with respect to Venezuela is also clear. In April 2002, the U.S. knew of and approved an attempted coup against the government. In the 2010s, the United States funded civil society groups actively engaged in anti-government protests. When the government cracked down on the protests, the U.S. followed with a series of sanctions. In 2015, President Barack Obama declared Venezuela to be, and I quote, an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States.
This comes just hours after it became clear that Trump had seriously miscalculated his military adventurism in Venezuela. Surely, this criminal's military might allows him to act as a bully and kidnap a head of state and his wife. But that doesn't mean people on the ground should also accept his criminal action as a virtuous attempt to liberate them. No wonder Trump was condemned by everyone in the Venezuelan government. And then today we learned that even those who oppose Nicolas Maduro politically have now joined the protest against the American invasion. This is a real achievement of Trump. He has done what even Maduro couldn't pull off politically.
We're in downtown Caracas. A huge march stretched through the city today, full of people who support Nicolas Maduro, who support the government, but also many people who don't, who never supported Nicolas Maduro. But what unites all of them is that what happened they find unacceptable. They simply cannot accept that America came. They bombed Caracas, their capital. They kidnapped Nicolas Maduro, and they thought that they could dominate Venezuela. What people here want to show is that they remain unbroken, that bombs and guns and jets won't break them, and that if the United States returns with the threatened military operation, that these people, they will resist, that the women, the men, even the children, they say, will continue to resist, and they won't give up their homeland, they won't give up their minerals, their oil to Donald Trump.
Trump, of course, found support from his criminal mates across Europe. What do you expect from racists who cheered the slaughtering of hundreds of thousands of unarmed and defenseless Palestinians in Gaza for more than 2 years? These comebacks have no shame. They continue to shame themselves and humanity in general. At least the world now knows what they mean when they talk about the Western civilization. Western civilization now effectively means support for a genocide and disdain for international law. It also means the laws of the jungle, where the powerful call the shots. And these racist clowns still want people to be sympathetic to the situation in Ukraine. If the Russian attack on Ukraine was illegal according to them, why the hell are they refusing to condemn the US attack on Venezuela? This is who they are. Genocide-loving, racist hypocrites. Just watch UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. I had played a clip of his in my earlier video in which he was refusing to comment on the US invasion of Venezuela. You can watch that video here. This was on the day the invasion and kidnapping had taken place. He wanted to wait for Trump's press conference. Starmer later tweeted justifying the illegal invasion of Venezuela and kidnapping of his president and his wife. This guy continues to stoop to a new low every single day. And we thought he had reached the lowest of the low during the Gaza genocide. He has now been interviewed by several UK media outlets, and his comments are for the history books. Starmer must be taught to children from the coming generations around the world as a case study on why even good education is no guarantee of someone's good character and moral values. Just watch him and his refusal to call the US invasion of Venezuela a breach of international law.
Has US action in Venezuela violated international law?
Well, the most important thing in Venezuela is a transition to democracy, a peaceful transition. Now, that was our position before the weekend. It remains our position. And in relation to the illegitimate president of Venezuela, there aren't going to be many tears shed.
No, but
I do think the framework, the anchor has to be international law,
right.
as you'd expect me to say. The situation is complicated. It's even complicated today. And obviously the US will want to justify its
But has
actions.
it violated international law?
Well, the framework
my
has to be international law. It's a complicated situation. The most important thing at the moment is that peaceful transition to democracy.
PM, France, Spain, Canada, Germany, as well as the UN Secretary General have all said that the US has violated international law. Has the US violated international law?
Well, international law is really important. It's the framework, and it's for the US to set out its justifications for the actions that it's taken. But it is a complicated situation. It remains a complicated situation.
So you're not going to say whether you think
the most important thing most important thing is stability and that peaceful transition to democracy. That's what matters to Venezuela above all else. And that was the position we took before the weekend. It's still our position
so
now.
You're not going to say whether you think they have or haven't, just to be clear?
I'm going to be clear that I believe in international law. I've long been an advocate for international law. I'm absolutely clear that is the framework that applies.
Okay.
Obviously, it'll be for the US to set out their justification in relation to the action that they have taken.
You don't want to call it out?
And this man has built his career claiming to be a defender of international law. His minions, too, made a fool of themselves as they appeared on various media outlets.
Would you urge the United States government not to abduct any other foreign leaders?
Look, I'm not going to answer hypothetical questions.
You won't urge the United States government not to abduct other foreign leaders?
We think the rules-based order matters and that people should comply with international law. When an operation like this
is... You're not making an assessment as to whether or not you think it has complied with international law?
Because it's for the Americans to set out the basis of the legal basis on which they did the operation, and then for international courts or the UN Security Council to take a view.
Let's look at Greenland, for example, right? We've had the Danish Prime Minister calling on the United States to stop the threats against a historically close ally and against another country and another people who have very clearly said they are not for sale. If Donald Trump's moves against Greenland or against, Denmark, is that a different matter? Will the UK government condemn that?
First, I'll be really clear that allies do matter, which is why these careful diplomatic conversations behind the scenes are ongoing with the United States and with our European allies and Five Eyes partners. And we're not going to give a running commentary.
But what about Greenland?
When it comes to Greenland, Denmark and the United States, these are both NATO members. And I'm really proud that NATO has used discussion over division to ensure that these problems in the past
Can you at least just say Donald Trump should not, do the same in Greenland?
What I can say really clearly is I can't see this being any different to any previous conversations that need to be had between NATO members.
And I find it extraordinary that you can't just say flat out that Donald Trump needs to.
And I think the Venezuelan issue
intervene on Greenland.
The Venezuelan issue
I find that extraordinary.
Is obviously different to the Greenland issue, but that's for them to have those discussions. It's for NATO to have that solid anchor to ensure that there is no division here.
So you don't have an opinion on whether or not Donald Trump should go into Greenland?
Well, look, this isn't for me to sit here and talk about hypotheticals. We could go on forever.
This is the Danish Prime Minister is talking about this. She's asked the US to step the threat. This is not a hypothetical.
And that's why it's really important that allies stand firm and ensure that discussions, and that's because we're not giving a running commentary on that. There'll be more in the House today in general, but of course...
But you can't say Donald Trump shouldn't invade Greenland.
Diplomacy is delicate, which means we're not here to give a running commentary in the news, unfortunately, as much as that would be fantastic for viewers and on Twitter, but it's the end results that matter, and working together with our allies and sticking to international laws is what we stand for as a country.
You must have a view about, for example, whether this was lawful.
It's for the Americans to set out the legal basis for their operation. This was their operation, not NATO, not ours in any way. I don't think the Americans have done that yet. I'm sure they will do in due course.
I wonder if they ever look back at these broadcasts. Does it never occur to them how they are causing embarrassment to their children and families with such shameful performances? How do they appraise themselves, if at all they do, when they go home after such horrible utterances? I suppose they know that the only way to climb the ladder in the government is by blindly following another blind person, who is Keir Starmer in this case. First Gaza and now Venezuela will forever remain a moral stain on Western countries. The root cause of Western countries producing so many human devils lies in a deeply corrupted electoral system, which is designed to promote greed and pure savagery. Don't be surprised if someday it emerges that Trump was actually manipulated and blackmailed into attacking Venezuela by the same Zionist lobby which makes him sponsor the genocide in Gaza. The same force that makes him hold a chair for a convicted war criminal and applaud baby killers both on the US soil and in the illegal settler colony. I'm saying this because Trump doesn't read from scripts, but that night he was reading from a script. Clearly, his masters wanted him to stick to the words that they had written for him. Now you may understand why I call the US an occupied territory of another settler colony called Israel. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your support of this platform and our journey.
You're selling out your own people, you fucking fraud. Your race is declining because of frauds like you, psyoping people to be simps for Israel while our country gets sucked away. There's a parasite eating away at our country. I care about this country. I'm the one calling out the real problem. You're a slave to it. Every time you open up your shit podcast and say this shit, slowly America erodes. The more billions of dollars go to Israel. Oh, oil. Oh, the oil coming in. Where is that money going to go to? What about the troops that are going to die in Venezuela when they're stationed there? Because Trump wants Marco Rubio and the new Zionist president of Israel to control it. Are you going to say the same thing? What about the 80 civilians that died in Venezuela? Christians, Catholic, just like you. You going to say anything about that? What about the wife of Maduro? Kidnapped, captured, brought here, imprisoned. The Catholic woman, Catholic family. You going to say that we shouldn't go and steal, bomb, and kidnap other Catholics? You're not. You don't care about your people. You're a talking head for the Zionist regime, and you know it. I care about my country. I care about my country. Learn how to make us some arepas, Matt Walsh, when all these Venezuelan refugees come into this country because of shills like you.
Say big salute to Sneeko. You know, I've been on Sneeko's stream before. I think we should do another stream. I saw he was streaming out in front of the courthouse where Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, are currently being arraigned. And he's like the only American patriot right now because he's out there saying, no occupation of Venezuela, no war on Venezuela. We don't want to be a part of this. He's calling out Andrew Tate, Tristan Tate, Nick Fuentes, Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, Laura Loomer. He's calling out all of them saying that, no, Americans do not support this occupation of Venezuela. It's not going to go well. Okay. You do your little stupid thing where you kidnap Maduro. Occupation's not going to go well. We shouldn't have done the kidnapping in the first place. But I got to say big salute to Sneeko because he's sticking his neck out when all these other idiots are going along with this Venezuela op. And he's saying stuff like this.
All you Trumpers, what about this? You're crying about immigration nonstop for years. Your major talking point, close the southern border. Now, Venezuela is part of our country. Refugees, come on in. Come on in. Is that what's going to fix America right now? The debt crisis, the housing crisis, the lack of health care is more Venezuelan refugees. Well done. Everybody that supported this and cheered this on, there you go.
Yep.
You think all the Venezuelans that are here already, you think that they want to go back? Of course they're going to.
He was interviewing these Venezuelan exiles that were celebrating the toppling of Maduro today outside the courthouse. And he's like, so you're going to go back home to Venezuela now that they got rid of Maduro, right? And they're like, oh, you know, no sé, no comprehendo, you know, ese, no sé, you know. It's just going to be more migrants.
Want to stay here. But there you go. Everybody that's supporting this, hope you like arepas. I like arepas. A little bit of hot sauce on it. Get used to it. You better learn a recipe. They're going to be your new neighbors.
Yep. He even got the nod of the hat from George Galloway here. This is a great clip.
Okay, Matt Walsh, you keep calling me stupid, but you ran from a debate. You're running away. If I'm low IQ, then why are you not able to have a conversation with me about Israel and their influence in America? One, we know it's because you're a little good goy bitch for your boss. Two, it's because you will get exposed. You suck at debating. You got demolished by that guy when you tried to talk about Haiti. I don't like Haiti because not realizing the effect that Americans have had in Haiti. You look stupid. You don't know anything about foreign policy. Second, you're just not allowed to. You switched up your whole identity was about how foreign policy should not make the same mistakes. How we went into Iraq and Afghanistan and it fucked up our economy.
He 6 months ago, Matt Walsh had all these tweets saying like, oh, you know, I oppose these endless wars, no more endless wars halfway around the world. No, we can't fight endless wars against these Islamic tribesmen. But I guess now he's okay with endless wars for oil and Venezuela, half as far away from D.C. as Iraq is, as Baghdad is. And instead of Islamic tribesmen, we're now going to be occupying and fighting against, ELN and FARC Marxist guerrillas that have been training and fighting for decades and have a decades-long, very serious grudge against the United States and imperialist forces, and would love to have an opportunity to have close combat with these U.S. occupiers. So, yeah.
Okay, then apply that same logic right now. And yes, we're in favor of America exerting its power to advance its interests. Okay, you're anti-interventionist. But now, yes, I'm in favor of exerting its power to advance its interests. Okay, but we're not in favor of other countries advancing their interests at our expense. What, because he was selling cocaine? You think that was what it was about? Wow, you got...
Cocaine doesn't even come from Venezuela, right? We know. Where do the drugs come from in Latin America? Primarily from Ecuador, which is a U.S. client state. And also Trump just pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who literally, his chief of staff or whatever, and they had like the initials of the president on the cocaine bags that they were the bricks that they were sending into the United States. And Juan Orlando Hernandez was caught on recording saying, we're gonna force the coke up the gringos' noses. Talking about that in recordings, it was all came out. These photos of the cocaine bricks, these recordings, this all came out in the court case, which resulted in Juan Orlando Hernandez being given a 45-year prison sentence in a U.S. prison, which he was serving until a few weeks ago when Trump pardoned him, because Trump wanted his political party, the right-wing U.S. puppet political party, to come back to power in Honduras in the elections, which they succeeded in doing by holding a bribe over the Honduran people and saying, we are going to destroy your economy if you don't elect the U.S. puppet government. If you do elect the U.S. puppet government, we're going to pardon your former president, the corrupt drug pusher, and guy who is moving weight allegedly to shove cocaine up the noses of the gringos. And we are going to give you a big check, big loan from the United States.
Got us with an insight. That's because we're Americans and we actually love our country and want it to succeed, unlike this guy. I'm a real American. I want our country to succeed. You're selling out your own people, you fucking fraud. Your race is declining because of frauds like you, psyoping people to be simps for Israel while our country gets sucked away. There's a parasite eating away at our country. I care about this country. I'm the one calling out the real problem. You're a slave to it. Every time you open up your shit podcast and say this shit, slowly America erodes. The more billions of dollars go to Israel. Oh, the oil coming in. Where is that money going to go to? What about the troops that are going to die in Venezuela when they're stationed there? Because Trump wants Marco Rubio and the new Zionist president of Israel to control it. Are you going to say the same thing? What about the 80 civilians that died in Venezuela? Christians, Catholic, just like you. You going to say anything about that? What about the wife of Maduro? Kidnapped, captured, brought here, imprisoned. The Catholic woman, Catholic family. You going to say that we shouldn't go and steal, bomb, and kidnap other Catholics? You're not. You don't care about your people. You're a talking head for the Zionist regime, and you know it. I care about my country. I care about my country. And put this in the clip. Matt Walsh, you stupid dum-dum. They just allowed more Venezuelan refugees to come in. Yeah, I care about America. Unlike this brown guy. That brown guy doesn't care. Okay, well then learn how to make us some arepas, Matt Walsh, when all these Venezuelan refugees come into this country because of shills like you. Yeah, this is good. The Venezuelans are celebrating. They're going to be your next door neighbor celebrating. Goofy. Learn how to cook some arepas. Learn how to speak Spanish. Welcome your new neighbors in. You wanted to close the border? The floodgates are open for the Venezuelans now.
Look, I'll just say it. My family came to America on the Mayflower. They were a part, they were the religious leaders on the Mayflower in the first, colonies. And they fought in the American Revolution, won, fought in the Civil War, won, fought in World War II, won. I think I'm like the most founding stock American there is. And I'm a son of liberty, right? I will say that Sneeko is far more of an American than Matt Walsh will ever be. Matt Walsh can go back to Tel Aviv. Matt Walsh can go to Tel Aviv. He can go to Kiev. He can go to Argentina and suck the toes of Javier Milikowski, the cousin of Benjamin Netanyahu. That's actually his real name. And yes, they actually are distant cousins or something. And Milei is Shabbat Lubavitch. He gave up his Catholic faith 2 days after he was elected, converted to Judaism, and then went and kissed the wall in Israel. So Matt Walsh, you can go be a patriot for those countries. Go be a patriot for Israel, these fake countries. And why don't you let America, for the people that actually don't want to send American boys and girls to go and die in Caracas? Why don't you leave America for the people that don't want to create millions of migrants that are going to come and flood into our country? It's simple. Sneeko is behaving and speaking like a real American here. Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro's top goy.
In cahoots with the Maduro regime. They're exporting terrorism to America, to the American hemisphere. And then they want these Hezbollah and Hamas to get their guys into the United States. So Hamas and Iran's and its proxies are a threat not only to us, but to Israel, all America's allies in the Middle East, and to America itself.
You fell for it again, stupid. Stupid. More refugees. Israel benefit.
Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, Nick Fuentes, the Ali Alexander pedo protector, Laura Loomer. Who else? Alex Jones, who I'm going to be debating tomorrow on his show at 1 p.m. Eastern. Fell for
Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, January 5th, 2026, and our dear friend Larry Johnson is here with us. Welcome back, Larry.
I'm glad you found the shirt there, brother.
Larry, let's start with what has happened in Venezuela. The Trump administration somehow managed to kidnap the Venezuelan president, the legitimate president of Venezuela, and they brought him to the United States. And when you look at the pictures, when I first saw the pictures of the Maduro, bringing him, in that sort of, it was unbelievable, somehow dark to see this sort of behavior on the part of the Trump administration. I remember, the picture that the Israeli government published, the last moments of Yahya Sinwar. They thought that those pictures would somehow, diminish the character of Yahya Sinwar. But it turned out to be, could be the opposite way. People would see this in a different lens. When you look at what has happened with the whole operation, what is your understanding?
Well, the story we're being told publicly is not what actually happened. What we know for certain is that Maduro is in custody. He was kidnapped, but apparently there was a very elaborate deal negotiated with that involved Qatar playing a sort of a go-between, and it looks like this is I'll call it a reprise of the Kill Bin Laden mission that took place, 15 years ago? Because you remember in that mission, the Navy SEALs, the SEAL Team 6, that flew in to capture Bin Laden, they didn't face any opposition. There was no air defense system shooting at them, and other contemporaneous reports from the Pakistani side at the time showed that basically the Pakistanis turned off all the electricity. there had been the United States had finally confronted Pakistan on the fact that they were harboring bin Laden, and basically Pakistan stood back and let the United States come in and grab bin Laden. That's what happened here. Uh, there was no air defense system in operation against these helicopters. They were carrying members of Delta Force, and these helicopters are flown by a group called Task Force 160. This was apparently, though, Maduro was guarded by 32 or more Cuban guards, and they were killed. Again, we don't know the circumstances. If I find it a little hard to believe that these Delta Force guys, rappel down out of their helicopters, or they're flying in little birds where they could just jump off and immediately run around and start shooting. Perhaps that's what happened. But the new acting president, this Delcy Rodriguez, she has ties to Qatar, and she was also the oil minister. It looks like there was some sort of deal in place, and maybe even Maduro, if you've watched if you've watched him with the photographs, he looks like he's still on the campaign trail. He's sitting there giving the 2 thumbs up, and he's smiling in some cases. I mean, it's very, very weird. So this is a play by the United States to get control of the oil in Venezuela. And then that brings the question, why? This isn't just for the U.S. economic situation. This is I believe it's a prelude to an attack on Iran. And the reason for that is the planners anticipate that when the attack on Iran comes by Israel with U.S. assistance, that the Iranians will shut down the Persian Gulf. The oil will stop flowing out of Saudi Arabia in particular, but also out of Iran, and that they'll have an alternative source here with Venezuela, which means get the U.S. oil companies in there and start pumping that oil. I mean, so people shouldn't look at this in isolation. This is something far more complicated.
Larry, what is the accusation against Maduro in the United States?
Well, they put out an extensive indictment. And look, I've one of my friends, retired CIA operations officer. He was actually the chief of the Latin American division. I wrote a piece the other day, and he really took exception to it. Now, from his standpoint and the way it's viewed within the U.S. intelligence community, Maduro was a very, very bad guy. But the problem I see with the indictment is one of the claims in the indictment is that he was facilitating drug trafficking by the Sinaloa cartel, which is up in Mexico, which I find very strange, because why would the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico go all the way south of to Venezuela to try to import cocaine into the United States? But it made accusations about his relationship with FARC and drug trafficking. The FARC is a Colombian group that has been fighting the government of Colombia since 1964. So it's only been around for 61 years, all right? The problem with that indictment is it doesn't have specifics. So, I've been involved with writing indictments or criminal complaints or complaints against, money launderers. And so one of the things you'd put in there are details like, on December 15th, Nicolas Maduro met with the leader of the FARC or Sinaloa cartel at such and such location and discussed X, Y, and Z and decided to take certain actions, which led to, you get to those level of specifics. You don't have that in this indictment. you have what I call guilt by association. Now, I'm not saying that Maduro was not involved with those activities, but when you read the indictment, it's very much of a more it's a political document. It's not an actual litany of specific crimes. So it's going to be interesting to see when this actually comes to trial, what success the government will have in trying to make its case. But in any way, it's like it's Maduro is no longer relevant. Uh, he's been taken out of the picture, much like Bashar al-Assad was taken out of the picture in Syria. And again, there was there were a lot of dealing going on behind the scenes that's not visible to the public. They're fed a narrative, and in this narrative, the United States bravely strikes out to take out this dictator. What we see, though, in Venezuela still is that the Venezuelan military is intact. There are apparently no U.S. troops on the ground. There was some sort of deal cut where basically the United States would get to haul out Maduro. The United States may get access to the oil industry again, and they'll try to make life will go on.
Donald Trump is, for such a long time, was arguing when he was running against Democrats and during his first administration and second administration right now, he always said that the regime change is a failure, is not going to work. And right now he's doing the same. He's turning into, some sort of regime change apparatus.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
his government is somehow amazingly, they're arguing that the situation with Venezuela is somehow different from what has happened in Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Do they really know? Because Marco Rubio says that. Marco Rubio, it seems that he feels that he's an expert of Latin America. No one else knows anything about Latin America.
Right. The Judge Napolitano, I saw his interview earlier with Alistair Crook, and he put together this montage of what Trump is saying now about, we're going to run Venezuela, essentially regime change, and then what Trump was saying 4 years ago about how, regime change is out of the question. And what's sort of frightening about this montage that the judge put together, his producer, Chris, did it, is how Trump has changed. Trump is, the other day, I don't know if you saw he's slurring his words and talking real slow, and he's not right. He is mentally, his age is showing through dramatically, but he has now put the United States in the position of trying to manage regime change. Look, the problem, what I have seen, good Lord, going back, 40 years. So when I was first exposed to CIA operations in Central America, when they set up the Central American Task Force to manage the effort to try to overthrow the Sandinistas, defeat the Sandinistas, the guy they put in charge of it was a fellow named Alan Fires. And Fires, his background was he worked with Arabs in the Middle East. That was his targets before. And they brought in a lot, and within CIA, there's sort of a hierarchy. Latin America was always considered sort of a backwater because it wasn't your very best intelligence officers were considered in places like the Middle East. So they came in with this attitude of superiority and really viewed the Central Americans with disdain, like, they're not that smart people. I call it the little brown people approach. Pat the little brown people on the head. You're very patronizing towards them. And yet, what I watched as an analyst is all these really smart gringos, like in the case of the Hondurans are running circles around us. The Hondurans were it turned out to be the great manipulators, not the United States. And I think that's what they're going to discover also in Venezuela. They do have a knack for, they're not going to be directly confrontational and pick a direct fight with the United States, but good Lord, to try to control what goes on in that country economically, with all the smuggling that's taken place back and forth across the borders between Colombia and Venezuela, and then Venezuela and Brazil. They just don't have an understanding of it in Washington.
I don't know how much of Venezuelan oil can they bring to the market, because the infrastructure is not that much prepared for that. And it's a long-term strategy, if that's the strategy. And how did you find the reaction on the part of the Venezuelan government and his, the vice of Maduro and the people in Venezuela?
Well, they're still based on the public comments, they're not giving in to this, and they reject the U.S. interference. The new acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, she has an interesting background. I don't know if you've seen the interview that Max Blumenthal did with her. It was a couple of years ago, but her father was a victim of CIA torture and died in prison. The CIA has had a long-standing involvement in Venezuela, and it goes back, decades. And it's always sort of stuck in its craw that, when Hugo Chavez took over, and won, he was won the election. He was democratically elected. We then went on a campaign to discredit him. Now, he did things on his own to discredit himself, but the worm didn't really turn until he nationalized the oil industry, PDVSA. It is, that took money out of the pockets of Exxon, and we've got to, we know through history that oil companies exert a lot of influence over the CIA in terms of working in partnership with the CIA to overturn governments. I think there is something that happened in Iran, 70 years ago, with a fellow named Mossadegh, who had the audacity to try to get control of these oil companies. And the reason, you've got to look at this, the economics of it. In the past, when Exxon was running the Venezuelan oil fields, it was extracting the wealth, but the wealth was not being reinvested in the country to raise the overall income and living standards. That's what Hugo Chavez and Maduro were supposed to fix. It depends on which narrative you want to follow. The Western narrative basically is the socialism pursued by Chavez and then Maduro has stripped the economy, weakened it. But there's other evidence to suggest that at least over the last 3 years, with Delcy Rodriguez playing an important role in this, there's actually been a revival in the Venezuelan economy. But Venezuela has also been a victim of Western sanctions. So, this is, Venezuela, I guess, is another chess piece on the board of this global chess game, and getting control of it and its natural resources, from at least the standpoint of the United States, is a move necessary in order to try to preserve the U.S. Dominated financial system that has been controlling the world for so long and is now in jeopardy of being overturned as BRICS becomes more important.
Larry, look at this picture here. Let me just bring this. I don't know what is. But the picture, by the way, that I'm trying to share with you, it shows the, the diminishing importance of Venezuelan oil from 1967 to 2000, because Chavez Maduro government comes in power in 2000. Before that, you see, you know, in the aftermath of their, their being in power in Venezuela, you see a drastic reduce in the oil market of Venezuela. So when you put a lot of sanctions on such a country like Venezuela, how can you imagine the country could grow? And I remember I talked with Alex Craner. In those old days, he was in Venezuela and he saw the government before, the Maduro Chavez government. And he said that the situation was not that much better than what it is today. And those governments were totally so much friendly with the United States. They were friend of the government in the United States, but the quality of life wasn't good in those days.
Yeah. Well, I mean, remember those, the predecessor, Carlos Andres Perez, who was president before Chavez, he was a controlled CIA asset. So the United States government had significant control in Venezuela, and this gets back to the purpose of governments. Are governments going to act in a way that they improve the lives of people? Do their incomes grow? Do they have health care? Are they more secure in their homes? And that's one thing, not to get off topic, but when you look at what has happened in Russia over the last 27 years, go back to 1999, when Putin came into office, the average, the lifestyle, the wealth, the security of the average Russian has increased absolutely dramatically. And that's because, Putin hasn't made the policy of going out and getting involved with foreign wars. Whereas in the United States, we've seen a decline, a deterioration in the sort of the middle class environment. And same thing, you've got this tremendous income inequality in Venezuela. And the growth of this income inequality really creates a lot of political pressures that disrupt societies.
Did you, I don't know if you heard or watched the latest, Donald Trump was talking with the press on Air Force, I think airplane, and he was asked about the situation with Venezuela, if that's different from what's going on in the Middle East. He somehow was saying that Iran should be prepared for the attack. He's watching what's going on in Iran. And if they, as they usually do, if they kill their people, I'm going to go there and fight Iranian. Is he going to send, weapons? Is he going to ask Israel to, attack Iran? Or he's going to do it by himself?
No. Israel, I believe. So let's go back over what's happened over the last week. A week ago today, at Mar-a-Lago, Bibi Netanyahu is meeting with Donald Trump. The day before that, on Sunday, you had this, and you can talk about this because you're in Iran, but the merchants in the central market, they locked down, they closed their shops. There was a protest that started. And the protest was against the inflation, which has been ravaging Iran. But it's the thing to remember is it's not like this inflation suddenly got worse a week ago. I mean, the inflation's been there all along through at least the last 3 or 4 months, if not longer. So you get the breakout of these protests, and the protests spread across the country. Now, some want to believe that that was just it's organic. And what I mean by organic is that people woke up one morning and said, damn it, I am so pissed off at this government. I can't live like this. I can't take it anymore. Let's go, go into the streets and begin hollering and said, oh, death to the Ayatollah. Well, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that there are foreign influences that bring money, and you can buy access with people and say, hey, if you get a group of 100 people together to go protest, to get out in the street and say and protest against the government, here's some U.S. dollars for you. I mean, $100 buys you a lot of Iranian currency these days. And so those protests then were concurrent with Bibi Netanyahu meeting with Trump, seeking permission from Trump to attack Iran again, and building the case, we got to get rid of Iran's ballistic missiles. And throughout the week, as these protests continued, stories started appearing in the Western media saying, "Oh my God, the look at all this strong opposition to the Ayatollah." Now, as you and I had talked about previously, you noted that there is a lot of anger directed at Pezeshkian and his government, and there are elements within the Iranian society that think Pezeshkian's been too accommodating of the West, not being too tough, but too accommodating. And then all of a sudden, out in Western Iran and Eastern Iran, Baluchistan out near the Pakistan border, and on the western side, you get some groups emerging with weapons, and they start shooting at Iranian police and security forces, and so they shoot back. And so it's in that context that you get Trump saying, "Oh yeah, if you kill those protesters, we're gonna come get you." Yeah, what are you gonna do, Trump? This is all orchestrated, in my view. And it's orchestrated not so much to create conditions in Iran that will foster a collapse of the government, but to create a narrative in the West that people go, yeah, we need to intervene to support the Iranian people, and some more regime change, and that's what's going on, I believe. And you're there, you can tell me if you differ, but one of the key groups, so you've got the People Mujahideen of Iran, the PMOI, or AKA the MEK, Mujahideen-e-Khalq, that were originally, the MEK in particular, was a designated terrorist group by the United States because it had carried out attacks in Iran on U.S. military personnel in the past. It killed 2 or 3. So the MEK was considered a terrorist organization until the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, rounded the MEK up, and then found, hey, we can use the MEK to attack Iran. And the MEK became a CIA asset. Mossad also got access to it. And MEK operatives in Iran, they've got family members and friends through their network. They were involved in the assassinations of at least 6 Iranian nuclear scientists back in like 2011, 2012. And so that's what's going on right now. That the MEK is trying to prepare Iran for, as part of this Israeli preparation to attack. And this brings us back to Venezuela, that the same week, so on Monday, a week ago Monday, Trump's meeting with Bibi Netanyahu, the protests spread, and then there's this taking out Maduro. Why? Well, if you're planning to attack Iran, and you fear that the Iranians would shut down the Persian Gulf. They threatened to do so before, but they didn't. But if they do so, that's going to cut off the flow of oil. If you can have an alternative source in Venezuela, because it's got the largest uh, quantity in the world in terms of what's available to be extracted. That I think that is one of the aspects that's playing into this. So that's why we shouldn't view this what's going on in Venezuela as separate or independent of what's going on in Iran. And at the same time, you've had, as we talked about last week, you've had this move to push the propaganda that Venezuela has become a safe haven for Hezbollah and Hamas. So it's all it's all stage managed.
How far do they want to go in Latin America, Larry? Because Marco Rubio right now is talking about Cuba. Colombia is in the background. How far is this sort of this so-called Monroe Doctrine would advocate go to, I don't know if they want to come to Brazil, they want to go to Brazil as well, but what is the understanding on their part?
Well, let's first clarify what the Monroe Doctrine is. The Monroe Doctrine is not the way it's been interpreted and talked about. In other words, that it gives the United States the right to control this hemisphere, and so we can determine who Colombia, Brazil, Peru, who they can associate with. And if we decide we don't like that foreign group, by God, they don't get to come in. That's not at all what the Monroe Doctrine was. President James Monroe, in a speech to Congress back in 1823, it was called the Seventh Annual Address. And as part of that speech, he talked about, say, look, we got all these European colonial powers that have taken territory here throughout, primarily Portugal and Spain. They had taken territory throughout the Western Hemisphere. The Brits too they had territories in the Caribbean, and the French, St. Croix. So his point was, we're not going to interfere if one of these European countries has a territory here in this hemisphere. We're not going to interfere with them unless the people in that territory declare independence, want to free themselves, then we'll get involved. So this was all about restricting and limiting the influence of European colonial powers in the Western Hemisphere. And it was specifically, Monroe laid out non-interference. The United States was not going to interfere. So, for example, Mexico was a colony of Spain, and the United States did not intervene militarily in Mexico to throw the Spaniards out. The Mexicans did that themselves in 1810. But 36 years later, the United States, in violation of the Monroe Doctrine, provoked a war with Mexico, in which we took Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of California from the Mexican, because previously that was the territory of Mexico. So the way the Monroe Doctrine is now being interpreted is that the United States gets to be the final arbiter of which foreign countries can have relations with countries in Latin America. So they're going to use Brazil's relationship with China and Russia through BRICS to target Brazil, but it's going to be done through intelligence channels. It's not going to be overtly military. The United States does not have the military capability, despite Trump bragging about how great we are and how powerful we are. We just can't afford militarily to get in battles with the Mexicans, with the Colombians, with the Brazilians. And you see, even in the case of Venezuela, we don't have troops on the ground. We got in a surgical strike, killed some bodyguards, and got the hell out.
Actually, he was ridiculous in Russia. He said, look at what we did in Venezuela. And Russia is for 4 years, they're fighting Ukrainians. They've done nothing. Look at how powerful we are. Look at Russia.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah, well, and look at the United States. United States has poured in all of this the supposedly amazing weaponry that would change the world, and it's failed. You know, the what Trump has done here is, I think, finally awakened the Russians and the Chinese to the fact that the United States is crazy. They are dealing with someone who's clinically insane. Is not thinking rationally. It was certainly not interested in building a better world, one that's interested in dominating the world for our own purposes. I think that this is going to lead to a fundamental shift on the part of Russia from the tone with respect to dealing with Trump. Uh, it's not just this; it was the failed attempt to kill Putin, which again place a week ago. You can't. If you look at these as like separate incidents, you're making a mistake. I think this is part of an integrated strategy, albeit short-sighted, to put Russia on notice, put China on notice, to where the United States is trying to retain its dominant position in the world of international finance. And Maduro in this case, he's the sacrificial lamb. Again, I'm not trying to say he was a great guy, a great Democrat, and really improved the lives of his people. But we always like to come up with the villain. You create this villain. By God, he's worse than Hitler, and then therefore we justify taking him out. And does it really actually change anything? I mean, we did it to Manuel Noriega. We did it to Muammar Gaddafi. We did it to Saddam Hussein, Milosevic, and the former Yugoslavia. This it really is. It's very much this Hollywood mentality of foreign affairs. If you've ever had the chance to go to Hollywood to pitch an idea for a movie or a TV series, one of the very first questions the studio heads will ask, so who's the villain? Who's the villain? Got to have a villain. And so we always create these villains and make sure that the problem with Venezuela has been Maduro, or before him Chavez, whereas as opposed, and like Russia, oh, Putin, man, if we just got rid of Putin, boy, by God, things would be better. And it's like, are you shitting me? I mean, really? You think that what's waiting in the wings if Putin disappears is going to be more accommodating and weaker than Putin? That's crazy. Yeah. So the West seems to have a death wish and is acting in ways that will be potentially devastating for the West, particularly the United States.
I think the point with the Trump administration is the energy, and they try to somehow dominate the market by these sort of moves. Look at what has happened in Venezuela, in Iran, the same mindset. Russia attack on tankers, attack on infrastructure in Russia. They won't somehow manage the situation with the energy, with the oil, but even there was an attack, Larry, on the China-Myanmar oil pipeline. When you bring all these data in, you see the policy is the neocon policy, but through the lens of the Trump administration.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't see Russia and China, and even the leadership in Iran, being so dumb to not understand what's going on with this strategy on the part of the Trump administration. Because it's all about the same thing. You can find, different path, different sort of strategy, but the main goal is the same.
Well, I think Russia and China have both tried to avoid a confrontation with the United States. And the United States continues to create reasons for them to have a confrontation with the United States. We've in this country we've been blessed by our geographic isolation. In other words, we've got Mexico on the south, Canada on the north, but they don't create any kind of military threat to the United States. And any other country that wants to attack us has to project force across an ocean. And so, but that hasn't stopped us from doing the exact opposite, where we take our military power and use it around the world to the detriment of other countries in order to benefit ourselves. And we've gotten away with it throughout the 20th century. I mean, really, the last sort of skirmish along the southern border with Pancho Villa back in the 1918, 1919. Other than that, the United States has never faced a threat at home, and we really have never paid any kind of price. We haven't seen our cities burned. We haven't seen our neighborhoods leveled like has happened to the people in Gaza, or is happening. The war that we provoked with the Russians is happening across Ukraine. One of these days, I fear that war will come home to the United States, and once the American people start suffering in that way, only then will the United States start become to change its ways. Because up to this point, it's like you can engage in the most risky behavior possible, and as long as you don't suffer any negative consequences, you keep doing it. You got an incentive to keep doing it, and that's what we're seeing in the West, particularly with the United States. We've not paid any kind of price in terms of blood for our wars in Vietnam. Yeah, 58,000. We build a wall, we cry over it. 58,000 is nothing. That many people die every year in a car accident. Okay, and that was 58,000 spread out over 20 years. So it's not a great loss. And similarly, Afghanistan, Iraq. I think maybe the total dead U.S. soldiers from both of those wars was like 4,500, maybe 5,000 over 21 years in Afghanistan. It's nothing. So the war has made us. It's been a profitable business in the United States. It's made people very wealthy. Why stop that? So that's how they view all of this. These wars starting a war with Venezuela, starting a war with Russia, it's a way to make more money.
Is the United States gonna achieve what they have in their mind by removing Maduro from power in Venezuela?
Has it worked anywhere? I mean, that's been the let's go back to, hey, if we just get rid of Mossadegh, boy, we'll have control over Iran and things will be peachy keen. How'd that work out? You got the Ayatollah Khomeini. So, Iraq, get rid of Saddam Hussein. That'll magically change it. In Panama, they got rid of Manuel Noriega, but Noriega was succeeded by corrupt governments that were, involved with drug trafficking and other things. So this outside interference to try to alter the course of policies in these particular countries, I don't see. There's not a single instance you can point to where it's turned out successfully, or the success is, like Vietnam has turned out well, not because of U.S. intervention, or let's say as a reaction to U.S. intervention, it has turned out well. They become rich, but it wasn't because of U.S. policy that made them rich. It was defeating the United States and then being able to have some self-determination. That's how they got rich.
Yeah, there were times that you and I remember Europe had somehow its own policy, its own sort of stance on many issues, geopolitical issues. Right now, you cannot hear anything coming out of Europe, anything constructive. Even with this attack on Venezuela, they failed to condemn what has happened. And how is Europe seeing its future with this sort of behavior? Ridiculous. They're becoming useless in the international, arena. All these important, I would argue, European countries, you see nothing coming out of the foreign policy.
Well, again, this has been a slow decline, and what accelerated was Europe's involvement in these wars, World War I, World War II. That sort of put the final nail in their coffin. We go back to the 19th century, where one of the things that President Monroe was reacting to was you had the French Empire, the British Empire, the German Empire, the Dutch Empire, Spanish and Portuguese empires were in decline. But they were in the 18th century, 19th century, they were fighting amongst themselves for control. And and you look back at that, it was this entire continent, ostensibly Christian. Their identity had been forged in battles with the Ottoman Empire, but yet they were fighting amongst themselves for supremacy. And the big conflict was usually between the French and the British, and then the French and Brits combine and they go to war with the Germans in World War I. But out of all of this, where Europe used to be the leader in industry, that was like where the Industrial Revolution really took off, and building factories and manufacturing, just about everything that could be imagined. Militarily, they were extremely powerful. They had the largest armies. Scientifically, the science out of the different universities scattered across Europe, they were like the Silicon Valley of their era. That's no longer the case. As you point out, Europe is in decline. It's not it's not the leader in anything, or whatever. It may have one or two areas that it is important, but it's no longer an essential continent for global economic wealth, other than it's just managed. It's a financial center, with the city of London in particular managing cash flows. But even on areas such as insurance, Lloyd's of London used to dominate the market in terms of insurance for foreign ships. Well, now they're losing. They are losing market share, and there are alternatives coming up. And Russia and China in particular, is this incredible industrial giant that the West simply cannot match. And the West is desperately trying to constrain China, and failing at every attempt. So, Europe is now irrelevant. They're still capable of, causing great damage and harm, but in terms of being a force for good and having a leadership role in this, that's gone. That's history.
Larry, I know that you're familiar with the case of Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, then Pakistan. Here is what Donald Trump argued with his sort of answer to the reporters. Here is what he said.
You mentioned something that's interesting. Lindsay mentioned bin Laden. I wrote about bin Laden 1 year before the attack on the World Trade Center, and I said, you got to go after bin Laden. It was in my book. And very few people want to say that, but it was in my book. You know that, I think. You've actually talked about it. But if they would have listened to me, they would have taken out bin Laden, and you wouldn't have had the World Trade Center tragedy.
Yeah, this is certainly going.
Did you know that? I predicted bin Laden.
I learn something every day.
No, but did you hear that?
I did
know
now.
that?
I just heard it right
No,
now.
I wrote a book. It was 1 year before the attack that the book came out. And it talked about, there's a whole page, a whole section dedicated to a guy named bin Laden, who's a bad guy who you have to take out.
So I'll get the book.
Even Lindsey Graham says, I didn't know about
Yeah.
The guy, Larry, I don't know if he's really in charge in the United States, because that would be tragic, because the way that he can be manipulated, because if his sort of mindset, he feels that he is the ultimate power in Washington. He dominates everything. But after all, we see something else coming out of the administration. He knows little about Ukraine. He knows little about the Middle East. And he talks big on all of them. But don't you think that could bring, you remember the problem with the Biden administration? Are we heading toward the same sort of situation?
Well, the presumption is that there is some clear strategy in place. And I don't disagree that there is some element of planning, but it's more for destruction as opposed to the vision is not. They're not sitting back and say, okay, how do we achieve a world in which the economies of all countries are strong, that the living standards for people across the world rise, that we can eliminate poverty, that we can eliminate the drug abuse that goes on that just cripples and destroys the lives of addicts. It's not a positive agenda. It's an agenda of how do we get in control, dominate, and dictate. And the like with respect to Russia, it's not about how do we in the United States, what can we do to create a strong relationship, a friendly relationship with Russia? How can we be friends with Russia? No, it's about how can we get control of Russia's resources? How can we bring the Russia under our domination? And the same with China. So, I've used the joke. It's like Hollywood agents. They're always trying to figure out what they can get out of somebody else, as opposed to, you think if you had an agent that said, "Hey, you're my actor, and what can I do to make sure that your career is great, that you get the best jobs, the best roles? Because if you do well, then I'm going to do well." As opposed to, what can I do to manipulate you, control you, so that I profit and screw you whether or not you're successful. It's that mentality. The United States is not keen on developing a prosperous world. We want to be the one in charge. We want to be on top.
Larry, you've mentioned that maybe the case in Venezuela is related to a new attack on Iran, but how about Russia? How about altogether? Because Russia, after all, after 4 years of the conflict in Ukraine, is the main, provider of oil and energy to Europe as well.
Mhm.
I don't know how fast Venezuela can replace Russia, can somehow bring its oil to the market, and how influential the current government in the United States could play a role in that sort of strategy.
Yeah, that's the critical question. We're told that the infrastructure in Venezuela is broken down. It hasn't been updated, hasn't been modernized. So I'm not sure how quickly they can turn around and start producing at maximum level. The real question is going to be, who's going to control that oil? Where are the financial proceeds going to go? Are they going to go to the government, or are they going to go into Exxon, or the United States? And are the transactions going to be strictly with dollar, the petrodollar? Or because in the past, Venezuela was selling to China using Chinese currency, the yuan. So this is, again, this is part of this global picture that the emergence of BRICS as an alternative to the U.S. dominated and controlled financial system, and it is that those people on Wall Street desperate to stay in control, desperate to stay in charge, and going after Russia is one element of that strategy, if you will, to take Russia apart, break it up, get control of Russia's resources. And again, it's such a dangerous, stupid way. The Russian people really are, the Russian government, they are genuinely interested in working cooperatively with other countries so that everybody does well. But sorry about that. But the West doesn't have that mentality, and I think we're headed for a confrontation. You had the attempt to kill Putin last week, and it was also they were targeting a nuclear command center. So this is the third time that the CIA has targeted elements of Russia's strategic nuclear force over the course of the last 3 years. And I think the Russians finally realized, we can't play around. We can't ignore this. So this is 2026, I fear, is going to be a very terrible year for the world.
Yeah. Before wrapping up, Larry, how did you find the reaction of the Chinese government? Because they're talking about Iran, Hezbollah, Russia being in Venezuela, but we know that China as well, Venezuela is important for China as well. But after all, since Venezuela is far away from Russia, Iran, and China, but how did you find the reaction on the part of Chinese?
Well, they're outraged, and they lost a lot of face. I mean, they've literally were meeting. I think it was the deputy foreign minister of China was meeting with Maduro, and they were just signing deals and making discussions 12 hours before he was attacked. And it's not even clear how did the Chinese representative, did he get out of China, or was he still there during this attack? So, I think Trump really, it's one of these, we feel good about the initial, quote, military success here, even though it was stage managed to minimize risk for the United States. I've got to mention, normally when the special operations forces will conduct these kinds of raids, they have a decided advantage of doing it in the dark when there's no moonlight because they've got night vision goggles. This was a full moon. Okay. This was, extraordinarily risky to take this kind of operation under a full moon because, I don't know if you've ever been out in a mountainous area or a jungle, even at night when there's a full moon. I remember, good Lord, I was living in Honduras back in 1978. And I was working on a development project. There'd be times when I had to go out at night to walk from one village to another, and the local Hondurans thought I was crazy. And it probably was, but I discovered when you got a full moon, you can move. You don't need a flashlight. You can actually see pretty well, even in a jungle. Remarkable. So my only point is, again, this was not staged in terms of trying to protect the lives of these attackers or the Delta Force operators, because they did it in a full moon instead of you normally wait for a cycle when it's not full moon. Just pointing that out as an aside.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
We are here today with Colonel Douglas McGregor, a highly decorated combat veteran and also the former advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense, to discuss a recent article of yours with the title "Team America's Back and Keeping with History Has No Real Plan." And I will make sure to leave a link in the description. I like the title, by the way. That's not sure if it's a reference to the movie, but
well, have you seen the movie, this puppet movie?
Yeah, it was back in 2003 or 4, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect demonstration of what's going on in Washington these days.
Well, what is going on in Washington these days? Because, of course, we couldn't. This was in reference to, of course, the attack on Venezuela, but it's not. I guess it has to be put in a larger context in terms of objectives and strategy, and also, I guess, what success would actually look like.
There you go again, asking all these tough questions. And there is no strategy. As I keep trying to tell people, I've been saying this for months about everything. There is no strategy. There is no coherent strategic framework that provides guidance for any action of any kind. I think everything is impulse driven. We have an emotionally charged presidency. Everyone is scurrying to get their cut of whatever financial benefit is on hand as a result of any action we take. So I just don't see any evidence for a coherent national military strategy, or certainly no evidence for a coherent grand strategy. And if you look at what happened, this is very typically American. We go in, we make a big splash, we declare victory, we congratulate ourselves, and then someone says, well, now what? So much beyond the planning and the preparation for the kidnapping or arrest, as they claim, of Mr. Maduro and his wife, there doesn't seem to have been a great deal of thought given. I think that was pretty evident when you listened to the president at the press conference. He said, well, what are you going to do now? I mean, that was the question everybody asked, what are you going to do? And his answer was, well, we're going to run it for a while. Going to run Venezuela for a while, a place the size of France, Germany, and Austria combined, with a population of somewhere between 28 and 30 million people. Great. We're going to run it for a while. Well, how do you plan to do that? Well, we'll figure that out. We'll do that. Well, Rubio Marco over here, he'll run it. I think that's what you're dealing with. As far as the operation itself is concerned, what I have been able to learn over the last couple of days from talking to people who have a lot of experience on the ground there and have a background in intelligence, which I do not, it looks like we spent an awful lot of money to buy out everyone who might interfere with our capture and arrest of Maduro. Now, it does seem that the Cuban bodyguard or security detachment, whatever it was largely eliminated. How that happened, did we do it? Was it done for us by mercenaries or other entities? I have no idea. But I think we did everything we could to avoid casualties. And this is another unfortunate feature of American foreign policy these days. And President Trump has fallen into this trap repeatedly. He leads with, well, we got in, we did everything, we had no losses. He said that about the attack on Iran when he bombed or allegedly bombed the nuclear facilities. And then he said it was wonderful, it was beautiful, it was great, it was super. And now we have peace and it's over. Well, we all know that's not true because Netanyahu was just in Washington, and it's pretty obvious to everybody, especially if you follow the Israeli media at all, that a new war is about to erupt with Iran. Now, they think they're just going to strike Iran with impunity. and potentially Iran won't strike back. I don't know. But I think we're headed in that direction right now. So I think the real question now for President Trump is, he said the same thing. We got in, it was wonderful, it was perfect, it was beautiful. We didn't lose anybody. Well, we did have one aircraft apparently that was badly damaged and had to abort, didn't participate in the mission. I guess that was the one Venezuelan air defense battery that had not been alerted to stand down and let us in. And of course, at the same time, we see this new vice president who's now become president. She's talking out of both sides of her mouth. On one side, she's telling everybody, we're going to work with the Americans. On the other side, she tells everybody, no, we're going to present resistance. No one can dictate anything. Bottom line is, I don't think there's any plan of action whatsoever. And my greatest fear is that this whole thing, if we press ahead on the current path, which is a path to uncertainty, it's going to cost us a lot of money, which is what's happened to us whenever we invaded anybody. We spend more time rebuilding these places and trying to restore some measure of order than we did to go in to begin with. So we'll have to see, but it looks that way right now, Glenn. It's pretty disappointing.
How do you link the Venezuelan war and war on Iran? Because, well, some would argue that if the U.S. can seize control over Venezuelan oil, then they can afford a war against Iran to have the disruption in the Middle East. On the other hand, we see that people like Machado, who got the Nobel Peace Prize, saying that if the United States would assist with the removal of Maduro, then the first thing she would do was to move the embassy of Venezuela from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So, yeah, essentially recognizing this as the new capital. Why is Israel a link to Venezuela here? That's a bit of a puzzle.
We do have, I think, effectively pro-American governments in most countries except for Brazil, I guess Colombia, and obviously Venezuela, at least in South America. Whatever pro-American means, I'm not sure what that means. Does it mean they're subservient to us, that they do business with us in a way that's advantageous to us? I don't know, but people talk about pro-American. As far as Iran and Venezuela are concerned, I think there was a desire to somehow or another punish Venezuela for its pro-Palestinian position or posture. That much is clear. But there were no, and there are no training camps for Hamas or Hezbollah in the country. That's a lot of nonsense. You could make a far better case for especially the Hezbollah presence in Mexico. They've always had a very large presence in northern Mexico within, shooting range of the American border with Mexico. For some reason, that doesn't come up very much. And you've also had large numbers of people that are Sunni Muslims affiliated with ISIS, al-Nusra, and Hamas, and others in Mexico. That doesn't come up for discussion very much. Although now, I guess President Trump has actually threatened Mexico as well as Colombia, Nicaragua, and Cuba with similar kinds of action. I don't know. I think that's very ill-advised because I'm not sure we can afford to pay everybody off to the point we did in Venezuela, so that our operation tactically will not go as we saw recently in Venezuela again. It's a very strange set of circumstances. Now, the thought about oil, well, the oil will somehow or another pay for everything. I remember Paul Wolfowitz, when he was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, testified on the Hill and said, oh, Iraq won't be a problem. Iraqi oil will pay for everything. Well, that never happened. So we lost trillions of dollars on that enterprise. The oil in Venezuela, when you look at it, I'm told, is sort of looks like sludge. It's very thick and it's difficult to refine. It takes time. It's very deep. It's hard to get out of the ground. It has a high sulfur content. Getting Venezuela up to, say, 3 million barrels a day or 4 million barrels a day is going to cost a lot of money and a lot of time. Don't think it's going to happen very quickly. So it's doubtful that the oil in Venezuela is going to have much impact on the world market. And that's another argument that's being made. Well, if we can get access to this oil, we can get it out on the market, plus our control ostensibly of Guyana's oil as well, which is next door to Venezuela. this is going to flood the global market with oil, and that will harm Russia and Russia's ability to conduct the war. No, I don't think so. It takes too long for all of this to have a real impact or effect. It may be a decade or more before the oil is successfully extracted in the volume necessary to make any difference. Now, there are mineral wealth there in terms of enormous quantities of gold. The gold mines down there are substantial, but I'm also told they're in terrible condition. And they have emerald mines, and they have rare earths and other things. But you've got to get into the interior. The interior of Venezuela is not highly developed. They don't have an extensive road infrastructure. So even if you get into these places, you've got to transport things out. That's going to be difficult. Again, I don't see any immediate strategic payoff or benefit to what we've done in Venezuela. It looks more like a vanity project for the president and the Secretary of State and Secretary Hegseth more than anything else. And obviously their donors are very interested in it for their, private reasons. And remember, the donors, who are overwhelmingly billionaires, they will inevitably see to it that they profit in some way from everything. But the rest of the 95% or more of the population sees no benefit from it at all. But we're currently dominated by the billionaire class. They seem to be calling most of the shots. That's my impression of this too. I think certainly it's something that appealed to President Trump. Remember, President Trump is someone who really believes that bullying others works. The tactic of bullying people is something that he favors. I think he learned that in New York City. That's typical for what goes on there, and not just in the real estate market. But it doesn't work very well in international relations. But I think all of these things are bound up in the rationale for it. But again, what's the end state? What's it going to look like? How are we going to get there? I don't think anybody has systematically planned anything. And so now we're waiting to see what happens next. And I think that includes people in Washington.
Well, the last time we spoke, we talked about the new national security strategy, and you made the point that there wasn't much strategy in that either. But the reference to the Americas, though, was more or less, the Western Hemisphere have to come back under U.S. control, given that there's now other centers of power. So can't afford to have the Chinese, for example, or the Russians operating in Latin America. And this has been something we've seen in the rhetoric about Venezuela as well. That is. Yes, we have not just Hamas and Hezbollah in Iran, but also have Russians and Chinese in Venezuela, which is not acceptable as this is America's backyard. But given that he actually put the term Monroe Doctrine into the national security strategy, do you see this being part of a wider development to put all of America's or denying access to other great powers? I know the original Monroe Doctrine was to deny European empires the ability to set up, but this is, again, something different. It would be to deny economic activity or with other great powers. So how is this how are you assessing this?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. The European audience needs to understand that this Monroe Doctrine was mentioned briefly by President Monroe and then vanished for all intents and purposes from the discussion politically in Washington or anywhere else until the 1920s. It was resurrected in the 1920s because we had participated in the First World War, and virtually everyone concluded by the 1920s that had been a terrible mistake, that all we did was rescue British and French imperialism. We lost 110,000 dead in 110 days fighting on the Western Front. People were horrified. And so President Harding and his successors in the 20s all said, we don't want to do this again. This is the last thing we ever want. And so the Monroe Doctrine came back into vogue or into usage then. And then we developed a strategy called hemispheric defense. And that essentially said, we're going to defend the hemisphere from everybody outside of it, so don't challenge us here. Now, having said all of that, I don't think it's very meaningful now at all. I think that's another sort of shibboleth resurrected to persuade people of something that's not really a problem. Glenn, we in North America, we, the United States, have dominated the Western Hemisphere almost from the moment that we won the War of 1812. I mean, once the British pulled out after they had another war without any strategy. It didn't work out very well for them. And so they said the devil with this and largely pulled out. I think what we're dealing with right now is something similar. It's there when we talk about, again, it's back to strategy. There is no strategy. Now, do we want the Chinese out? Well, that's become very popular. You know, anywhere you see Chinese evidence for Chinese business or commercial interest, that's a threat. That has to be stopped. That has to be crushed. Nobody has passed any legislation inside the United States preventing the Chinese from investing and owning great quantities of agricultural land in the U.S. And I always tell people, well, if you're very concerned about the Chinese, let's start at home here, as opposed to telling everyone else who lives in the Western Hemisphere you can't do business with the Chinese. And here's a message for everybody. The Chinese are heavily engaged all over South America. And the Chinese are basically businessmen. They are there to get something. They want something, whether it's soybeans, which they recently managed to get from places like Argentina and Brazil, or they're looking for mineral wealth, you know, or oil or anything else. If they can't get it from Venezuela, they're not going to go to war. They're going to go somewhere else. The world is a big place. The Chinese are not interested in fighting for anything. They want to do business. The Russians are a little different. They're not as heavily invested commercially. For the Russians, they were very interested in the gold, frankly, that is in Venezuela. Venezuela supposedly has 22 billion in hard gold reserves, and they have a lot of gold in the country. The Russians are not going to lose any sleep over it, though, because Russia, according to most of the sources, if you go research them, apparently has more gold sitting in Russia than any other country in the world. So it's not life or death for Russia, just as it's not life or death for Russia or China or anybody else about the oil in Venezuela. So it's very hard to sort through all of the rhetoric and the discussions and the statements. By the way, during this so-called period of the Monroe Doctrine, there were over 30,000 troops from France in Mexico, or it's 30,000 French troops. So who are we kidding? This whole Monroe Doctrine thing is unworthy of serious attention. But people are not stupid, and the Chinese and the Russians, the Iranians, anybody else who has an interest in Venezuela is not stupid. They are not going to challenge us in the Southern Caribbean, in the Caribbean Basin. We should never have challenged the Russians in Ukraine. It was a dumb idea strategically. How dumb can you get? The Russians can win any battle on their turf. We can win any battle in the Southern Caribbean. It is simply a fact of life. So I think there are a lot of people that they're treated to these sort of tropes about democracy, freedom, rights, or not, democracy, human rights, and freedom. We said the same things about Iraq. We've said that in many, many places at many different times. It's all meaningless. But I think this time around, Washington has sort of fooled itself in a big way. We're not going to profit very much in the short run at all from anything we do in Venezuela. And I think we're going to see conditions there develop very negatively for us. And I hope the president will at least have the good sense to keep us out. Committing the 14, 15, 16,000 troops sitting in Puerto Rico at this point would be asking for real trouble. But that may yet happen.
Yeah, I thought Trump was a bit premature to. I mean, it was a little bit like his Bush mission accomplished moment, where he, he said we're going to run Venezuela until we find a new government, but they don't actually control Venezuela yet. They captured Maduro and put him on a perp walk, but beyond that, this is not quite a victory yet, which he might have taken a bit premature. But I've seen a lot from the Israeli media, though, that they kind of link how quickly the United States took down the Venezuelan president, and essentially, well, more or less saying Venezuela today, Iran tomorrow. Do you see this as a logical step? Because before you listed some Latin American countries, which Trump would go after next.
Yeah, but I don't think he will for the very reasons that we're discussing. You can go in and initially remove whatever key people you would like, but that doesn't fundamentally change the situation on the ground in any of those countries. If you're going to try and change it, well, then you have to go in on the ground. We were in Vietnam, and at the height of the Vietnam conflict, we were there for 10 years, at least 8 years with troops. And at the height of the war, we had 550,000 men on the ground in South Vietnam. We never completely controlled Vietnam. If you go to North Africa and Algeria, and you look at the French there, they always controlled whatever they could stand on for any length of time. And when they took their foot off it, they no longer controlled it. I mean, this is the sort of thing that you learn from history, and we don't seem to have learned it very much. I always liked Genghis Khan's observation about occupations. He said occupations turn soldiers into jailers. So the Mongols never occupied anything. The Mongols would leave a small force inside the country near the capital, the ruling elite, and they knew that they had to pay the tribute and do what the Mongols said as far as the Mongol interest was. And the Mongol interest was largely commercial and taxes. As long as they did that, they were safe. If they violated that, then the Mongols would return and kill everybody. But he did not bring in hundreds of thousands of Mongolian troops to occupy anything because it was a waste of time. It's amazing how frequently we make this mistake. We just can't do it. And the other thing is we go back to World War II. Well, look what we did in Germany. Look what we did in Japan. Well, at the time, the Germans were very cooperative because there were 15 million Soviet troops sitting on the other side, 5 million poised to attack West. So under those circumstances, I think you could expect cooperation out of the Germans. I mean, we got to make a choice. Communism and Russians versus Americans and Brits. In Japan, it was a little different. We had flattened the country. We'd killed hundreds of thousands of people in the bombings, and Japan was prostrate. And the decision was made, we'll cooperate. And obviously, they also knew they had the threat of Soviet intervention. They didn't want the Soviets landing in Japan and raping all the women and destroying Japanese culture and civilization, which is what they did wherever they went in Eastern Europe. So there were reasons why the Japanese and the Germans cooperated. And the other thing is that we were a little more enlightened in those days. We recognized that the people that had to rebuild the country were local, indigenous. In other words, the Japanese and Germans. And the Japanese and Germans, very sophisticated, highly educated people, very intelligent. And ultimately, they took over and they rebuilt the country. You know, we've gone to various places. We deal with people who are radically different from the Japanese and the Germans, and we're surprised things don't work. Now we're in Latin America. We're not going to have any success in Venezuela. Nobody down there wants us in their country. I'm quite certain of that. And, you know, I listened to Secretary of State Rubio on Sunday talk about, well, we want two things. We want success for America. We want the Venezuelan people to be successful. We want them to be happy. Okay, good luck with that. Nobody wants a foreign army in their country under any circumstances. So we're back to where we started, Glenn. What's the plan? And the plan doesn't exist. And frankly, I don't know what they're going to come up with.
So how do you make sense of this return of Team America, as you say, or the direction of Trump or the United States now? Is this simply more of the same, but with different branding that is shedding this whole liberal democratic guise for legitimacy or respectability, or do you see something very different taking place, given that many fear that the relative power in the world could be of the United States could be in decline, or is this just how are you assessing, I guess, the larger direction of world order based on what you see now from the Trump administration and where it might go next?
Well, the old order is disintegrating. Even the dumbest politician in Washington is aware of that. What they aren't aware of is that you can't put it back together again. That's the problem. There are too many people who are betting heavily on American military power as a means of piecing back together again the so-called post-war liberal international order. It's not going to happen. And our financial position is so fragile We're in such such terrible indebtedness, and that's affecting everything that happens in the United States now commercially. That people don't seem to really understand that there's trying to put the old order back together again is not going to work. I mean, everybody's assumptions about the world are anchored in the past. NATO is disintegrating. The EU is disintegrating. Everybody's angry with Orban. Well, Orban is simply making reality, or making a statement that is based on reality. The interests that underpinned both NATO and the EU no longer apply. People have different interests. The world has moved on, but nobody wants to accept that in Washington. They're all believers that, wow, we know this will save NATO. I think to a large extent that's what's happening, in answer to your question. And they think that by the use of military power that this is going to work. I mean, the reason that I like Team America is when I listened to Secretary of War Hegseth give his little spiel at the end of the discussion and say, America's back. We're here and nobody's going to tell us what to do and we're in charge. And this president means what he says. Oh, that's all bravado. And that will go down well with a lot of people in the United States. Who'll say, I'm glad we're being tough on those Venezuelans. I'm glad we're being tough on those Russians. It's about time. But it's all bluster and nonsense. If you are who you say you are and what you are, you don't have to threaten anybody. If you go back to the Suez Crisis, when the British and the French and the Israelis moved in to seize control of the Suez Canal, Eisenhower didn't have to threaten the use of military power. He made phone calls and said, look, this is going to cost you dearly if you don't get out. We don't support this. You didn't discuss this with us. I'm telling you, get out. And it happened. We don't seem to understand that the most effective use of force lies in not using it, but in possessing it, and for it to be credible. All we've done is sort of taken somebody in the first or first grade or second grade at recess and told the high school football team, go down there and beat the crap out of these kids in elementary school and bring them into order. Tell them to realign, do what we're telling them. Well, the high school football team has no difficulty dealing with people in elementary school. So we didn't have much difficulty dealing with Venezuela. It's the same principle, but it's all nonsense. And I think, unfortunately, we're on this track. And President Trump has fallen victim to it. It's back what I said before. My great fear is that we'll put ourselves into a position where we go in and we take casualties, where we're soundly defeated in some demonstrable way, and everyone is shocked because we've gotten everybody accustomed to sort of suppressing weak opponents and suffering very few casualties. So that's one problem. The second problem that you're mentioning is there is no strategy per se. This was a target of opportunity, and everybody had some reason to go in there. What they don't have is a way to stay and make it work. And I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Yeah, it's funny when you see different American leaders always insist that we've never been more powerful. It's a bit like the European leaders saying, reminding everyone what wonderful values they stand for. I mean, if you have to remind someone all the time, then there's probably some insecurity going on.
By the way, Lord Salisbury, who was a prime minister of Great Britain around the turn of the century, I'm talking about 1900, he once said, if my generals and admirals were allowed to do it, they would garrison the space between Earth and the moon on the grounds that there was a threat. In other words, we're in that same position right now. And the truth was that in 1900, Britain was more secure than it had ever been in its history. There was no reason to spend as lavishly as they did on the military. We have the same condition here. Our problems are all internal to the United States and on our borders. There's no real reason for us to go anywhere to do anything militarily. But, this is part of the game that is played. Some people call it late stage empire behavior. So back to your original question, are we in decline? I think it's pretty clear that we are. Are we headed to the graveyard? Are we finished as a great power? No, of course not. But there's a failure to understand there are cycles. If you overspend, If you engage in imperial overstretch and your economy suffers and you mismanage it, you're going to decline. You're going to go into a slump, and that's where we're headed. Is that slump permanent? Certainly not. Will we be back? Of course. But no one wants to admit this in Washington. And so we're spending money we don't have, printing money that has no value. We're debasing the currency. We're making matters worse. And we're adding to the numbers of people in the world who dislike us unnecessarily.
Well, it often seems as if the big source of many of the wars we have today would be this transition we're currently in between two world orders, that the hegemonic era is over, and we now see a shift towards multipolarity. At the beginning of the Trump administration, we had the interview with Marco Rubio, which made the point that, well, unipolarity was a temporary condition, it's now over. Do you see the Trump administration making its peace with being one among many great powers, or do you see this essentially being part of or guided by the desire to, I guess, fight multipolarity and restore the hegemon?
I think the Trump administration and its leadership understands the futility of going to war with Russia over Ukraine. They recognize that that's a losing proposition. They recognize that the Europeans have the wherewithal to defend themselves, and they are increasingly interested in seeing the Europeans take responsibility for their own defense. I think that privately, no one at the top of the Trump administration believes that Russia wants to march on Europe. In other words, march through Ukraine, cross the Polish border, and go all the way to Berlin or Paris. That's all nonsense, and I think they understand that. At the same time, I think they also understand the futility of going to war with China over Taiwan. You know, the outcome there would be even more terrible than what we've seen in Ukraine. I think they understand that. And Trump is enough a businessman to know that he really does want to do business with China. It's impossible in today's world. China has been producing, 50% of the global GDP. You know, take China out of the equation and we all fall apart right now. I think President Trump understands that. So then the question is, what do you do in the two remaining hotspots? One is the Middle East, and the other is in Venezuela at the moment, or the Caribbean Basin. Well, we've taken action in the Caribbean Basin. To what end is unclear at this point. We're going to have to wait and see what sort of ideas they come up with. But in the Middle East, that's a different story. We have a group of billionaires who own and operate the government. They own the Hill. They own the presidency. They want war with Iran. Now, the problem with war against Iran is that that's not the end of the story. Right now, I think Israel and the Turks are on a collision course in Syria. And that could become very serious very quickly. I think that's one of the reasons in Netanyahu's mind that he, quote unquote, wants to knock off Iran before Iran could become a factor in that conflict. We are pawns. We're going to do whatever he demands. President Trump has made that very clear. Whatever Bibi wants, Bibi gets. So we're going to be dragged into another war in the Middle East, this time with Iran, and it could widen quickly. I mean, it's just it's a tinderbox. It could go up in any number of different directions. In Venezuela, it may be that in 2 or 3 weeks we don't hear about it anymore, because someone has wakened up and realized that we can't control the place. You know, what do you do about the millions of people that supported Maduro and Hugo Chavez? Do you eliminate them? Do you replace them in the administration and the government? We tried to do that when we set out, according to Wolfowitz, to, quote unquote, denazify Iraq, because suddenly, you know, the Baathists were effectively Nazis. Well, that didn't work out very well. That cost us trillions. It made a mess of the Middle East. So arguably, Israel is now less secure than it's ever been as a result of all the actions we've taken and the actions we've taken in concert with them. So I think maybe in 2 or 3 weeks, we'll know, if we don't hear much about Venezuela, that we're not going to go into Venezuela. And contrary to what Secretary Rubio hopes, he may not end up as the viceroy of Central America. Because remember, in the back of his mind, he wants most of all to sort of liberate Cuba. That's his pet project. And if we can liberate Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela, then we can liberate Colombia. Interestingly enough, nobody talks about Mexico, which is the principal source of our problems, and the drug cartels there is very strange. That's going to come back to haunt us. We're going to end up in a war with the cartels in Mexico. In fact, we are at war with the drug cartels in Mexico, but we don't talk about it, but we are. And it's going to get a lot worse. So that's going to happen. The war with Iran is going to happen, and we could see this war widen to include the Turks. And we know that when they bomb Iran, they'll bomb Lebanon, they'll resume killing people in Gaza. All of this will recommence. The difference this time around is that I think the region is more prepared for it, particularly in Turkey and Iran. So that I think will become the focal point, whether we like it or not Latin America.
Well, you can add many more uncertain variables here, though. That is, first of all, we have other great powers who see primarily China and Russia, who doesn't want to see Iran fail. Of course, they would do more to defend as opposed to creeping up into America's backyard in Venezuela. But also, the United States could face, along with Europeans, a massive economic crisis in the near future. Do you see the possibility of these things, well, I guess, clashing, coming together?
Well, the perfect storm would be a bankruptcy in Europe and the United States, along with the outbreak of war in the Middle East in a major fashion. That would be the perfect storm for us. It would destroy everything. And I think that's on the minds of the globalists who dominate the scene in Paris, London, Berlin, and Warsaw. I can't predict when that financial dissolution will begin. I think the crisis is already underway. I keep getting all these messages from friends who are involved with the Fed talking about $31 billion passing unnoticed into the banking system to keep the banks solvent and liquid through the repo window. And the same thing true with private equity funds. So we know we're continuing to quantitatively ease, whether we admit to it or not. So it's happening in those two areas, the private equity funds, which are very vulnerable right now, as well as in the banking system. So it's going to fall apart. I can't tell you when, but most people looking at it right now, I think, oh gosh. Well, normally I talk about Alistair McLeod, who is the gold expert, and he is certainly worth talking to. James Grant is worth talking to. Ray Dalio has made these points. There are a lot of people out there talking about this, even Warren Buffett. If you look at the precautions he's taken with his own wealth, he's been warning of, the worst financial crisis, certainly since the Depression, and many of them are predicting what's coming is going to be worse than the Depression. So that's out there. Okay, that's coming. Nobody can say tomorrow, next week, next month, but it's coming. So that's a problem. That will change everything. And in fact, privately, several people that have looked at us and our sort of, what's the right word, reckless behavior in the world, on the world stage, are seeing this as perhaps the thing that will save the United States from itself, bankruptcy. That could well turn out to be the case. But at the same time, you're right. Great powers are interested in what happens in the Middle East. They're very interested. The whole BRICS conglomerate is interested in what happens in the Middle East. Venezuela is a very small portion of what BRICS is going to become in the future. But Iran is different. The Persian Gulf is different. Central Asia is different. The Belt and Road, all of these things play into it. So I think you're 100% right. I would prefer to see the bankruptcy happen outright first, because that would operate as a constraint on our foolishness. But it may not work that way.
Yeah, well, that's why I don't like the idea of Venezuela today and Iran tomorrow, because Venezuela is kind of micro-militarism. It's an easy target right on the U.S. border, and no one will interfere. Iran is a huge military power with close ties to other great powers in the region. They're willing to operate. So there's always problem with military, I guess, mission which is too successful. It tends to embolden, and yeah, that becomes a problem as well. So,
well, remember something else, and I'm sure you've seen this. MI6, CIA, and Mossad have been working overtime through the mainstream media in the West to create the illusion that Iran is about to implode internally, that revolution is imminent, that the leadership of the country are preparing to flee and fly to Moscow and all this sort of business. It's not true. If anything, what's happening inside Iran is a healthy thing because you have a confrontation between reformers and conservatives. And I think the ultimate outcome will be that Iran will continue to develop positively in the future. It will evolve away from this state that was founded 40 years ago. That's underway. It's only going to continue. But Iran itself is united nationally against the external enemy, namely Israel and the United States. And no one should doubt that. So I hope if your audience in Europe is being treated to the same nonsense that we are in the media, they should understand that. Iran, as you say, is not going to be easy pickings. And my great fear is that in a situation where Israel becomes frustrated, they would turn to the use of a nuclear weapon. I hope not.
yeah. Well, Colonel, as always, thank you, and yeah, Happy New Year's.
Yep, that's right. Happy New Year to you and everyone. Thanks, Glenn.
To the program, everyone. As you can see, I have with me Professor Jeffrey Sachs. It's great to be back with you, Professor Sachs. Welcome back to the show.
Happy New Year. Thank you.
There have been more details that have emerged from the Venezuela operation, the military operation that saw the kidnapping of Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro by the U.S. military, as well as airstrikes that now have been reported to have killed upwards of 80 people, 32 Cubans who were part of President Maduro's security detail. I wanted your comments on to this operation and what it says about the Trump administration and the foreign policy that he is wielding.
Well, this is a brazen, illegal, dangerous operation, and we're only at the early stages of its implications. But this kind of regime change operation, which is part of the American security state toolkit, has really become completely unleashed by Trump, especially in recent months. So the United States is at war or threatening war all over the place right now. And what has happened is extremely dangerous. To my mind, it is in grotesque violation of the US Constitution, but I think in general, we are in an extra constitutional state. In other words, we are not anymore a constitutional republic. We are in the hands of the military industrial complex, and Trump has unleashed this in Venezuela, and he is making threats to do the same all over the place right now. Of course, in the past year, the United States has also bombed many countries, recently Nigeria, also Yemen, Syria, and the list is up to 7 countries that the United States has recently bombed. And of course, Trump and Netanyahu are threatening a renewed war on Iran. So what we're seeing is something that is dangerous, unconstitutional, brazenly illegal by international law, meaning in grotesque violation of the UN Charter. And unlikely to be the last of such episodes in the near future, but one of many potential episodes. I think the United States is basically going rogue on any international standards or domestic law.
And President Trump has continued the threats. I want to play for you what he told The Atlantic regarding new Venezuelan president, now the sworn-in president, former Vice President Delcy Rodriguez. This is what he had to say to her when Delcy Rodriguez told the Venezuelan people that she was not going to bow, or Venezuela was not going to bow to his ongoing threats.
That's right. I called him this morning a little after 9:30 a.m. He had just arrived at his golf club in West Palm Beach. And I asked him to respond to what Delcy Rodriguez said yesterday in her televised address, which was not consistent with what the president had said in his press conference. And his answer to me was, if she doesn't do what's right, she's going to pay a very big price, probably bigger than Maduro.
That is what Donald Trump had to say to now the current president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, although Delcy Rodriguez says Nicolas Maduro remains the president.
We have a thug as president of the United States, and threatening the lives of other world leaders, kidnapping them, threatening the worst, threatening other leaders like President Petro of Colombia is thuggery. We have an international law to prevent human annihilation, to prevent the tragedy of international anarchy, replacing it with international law. Trump is ripping up the UN Charter, obviously not paying an iota of attention to it. And my view is this is extraordinarily dangerous.
Professor Sachs, what are the possible implications in the medium and long term of this operation? Because as you know, as we're speaking, Nicolas Maduro is in New York going to be arraigned. He is being charged under supposedly domestic law in the United States. Yet this was an operation that where Trump says that he is going to control and run Venezuela. His administration is going to run Venezuela from now on. And that's why there is a massive military presence still surrounding the country. What are the possible, you said that this is dangerous, what are the possible implications moving forward?
Well, I think there are specific dangers in Venezuela, and then there are more general dangers of complete international lawlessness by the United States and by contagion other countries as well. When it comes to Venezuela, we're in the first days of a purported regime change operation. I would estimate that there have been 100 such regime change attempts by the United States since the end of World War II. And most of them lead to prolonged disasters of one kind or another. We've had regime change operations, for example, people will remember Iraq or know about it. Everyone in the White House was chortling about the great success and the great triumph, and we saw pictures on the street of the waving people and so forth. And we know that it plunged Iraq into years of chaos and violence and economic crisis and social crisis that has not by any means come to an end to this point. And that history is repeated dozens of times. Libya, the United States brought down Muammar Gaddafi in the fall of 2011. Libya is in a civil war today, 15 years later, or a little more than 14 years later, to be precise. So we're in the first days of this American adventure, this illegal, brazen adventure. The government of Venezuela has not changed. There has been a kidnapping of the president, but the government of Venezuela is intact. Trump says the United States runs Venezuela. That remains to be seen. Trump is full of bluster and bravado and maniacal sentiments, but these don't translate to reality quite as simply as the president boasts.
Yeah, Professor Sachs, I don't know if you heard him on Air Force One. He said that before and after the operation, he consulted not with Congress, but the oil companies.
Before the operation took place? Yes. Did you maybe tip them off? Before and after. And they want to go in, and they're going to do a great job for the people of Venezuela. And they're going to represent us well.
And I'm curious if you have thoughts about this, because many are saying that the Donald Trump administration, especially this time around, is really pulling the mask off of the U.S.'s empire.
Well, I don't think there's much of a mask if you take the time to look. Interestingly, of the many dozens of documented regime change operations by the United States, the U.S. Typically denies most of these. So the U.S. government lies for a living, and it's our job to understand beyond the lies. It's not so hard because what the U.S. does is rather brazen, the U.S. government, that is. And in the case of Venezuela, the United States has been at regime change at least for 23 years. In 2002, there was a coup attempt in which the CIA had foreknowledge, gave approval. The United States wanted it to go ahead. Hugo Chavez succeeded in keeping power despite the coup. But the U.S. was already engaged in regime change in Venezuela in 2002. In the late 2000s, the late noughts, around 2007 onward, the government of Venezuela took increasing control over its vast oil reserves. And this, of course, caused a rupture with ExxonMobil, a very powerful actor in U.S. politics, a major funder of U.S. politics. And from that point on, there was an intensification of the U.S. government's war with Venezuela. My guess is that the U.S. made several attempts to bring down the regime through kind of color revolution operations in 2014, much disputed, but you can look at how things work. And then from 2017 onward, in Trump's first term, through absolutely direct and brazen attempts to break the Venezuelan economy, which in fact the U.S. sanctions did. Between 2016 and 2020, oil production in Venezuela, because of the sanctions on the state company, fell by around 75%. The GDP per capita fell by around 60%. This is a catastrophic decline. The U.S. sanctions played a huge role in that. It did not bring down the regime, but that was the intent. So Trump has been after the oil and after regime change since the early days of his first term. In the fall of 2017, interestingly, at a dinner that Trump hosted with several Latin American leaders on the margins of the UN General Assembly, Trump spoke openly about his thought of the U.S. invading Venezuela. And other Latin American leaders at that dinner told him that's not a good idea, Mr. President. But he was already thinking about this invasion back in 2017. So this is a long-term effort. I think it's important when people try to understand, work to understand U.S. foreign policy. These are projects that often take place over a 20-year period. The project to bring down the government of Venezuela is a 2-decade-long project. It gained special force by the recognition by the United States in around 2007, actually by the U.S. Geologic Survey, that Venezuela's oil reserves are the largest holdings of any country in the world, larger even than Saudi Arabia's. So this has been a long effort. If we talked about other topics, Ukraine or Syria or Palestine and Israel, these are all long, deep state efforts. What's distinctive about Trump is that he unleashes the most violent impulses of the US security state. He has no foot on the brake, only on the accelerator. He tells us what he's doing pretty brazenly. And it is unconstitutional and in violation of international law. But when that is raised, he'd say, Constitution? What are you whining about? International law? That doesn't exist. We're America first. So this is very crude, very dangerous, and there's a lot more to come, I'm sorry to say.
What does the Trump administration, the U.S. as a whole, as an empire, what does it want from Venezuela, from Latin America? This is some are seeing this as a major shift in U.S. foreign policy. I see it as more of maybe a reorientation. But what is it? Is it the oil? I mean, Trump is not necessarily hiding that fact, but is there something more to why the Trump administration in the United States right now are waging this, heavy policy of aggression?
Well, I think it's an unleashing of the deep state impulses. The U.S. has continuing hegemonic aspirations, of course. It understands better that it faces other real superpowers, China, Russia. I think, by the way, India is one as well. The U.S. Hasn't really come to grips with this reality, but it has raised anxiety. And so Trump is, yes, pulling off the mask or pulling off the gloves and right now using American power to bully and bluster and attack at least the smaller and more vulnerable states. And this is part of the basic deep state approach of U.S. hegemony, crasser than we would see in other administrations. But frankly, we haven't had really a peace-oriented president for a very long time. Trump says it out loud. Others do it more covertly, but it's been pretty ugly for a long time. It's getting uglier. There's a lot of anxiety in the United States to keep its supposed number one pole position, whatever that really means. But Trump is after, as he said, complete domination of the Americas. He doesn't even hide that fact. He doesn't see these neighbors as sovereign. He doesn't see Canada as sovereign. He doesn't see Mexico as sovereign. He doesn't see Greenland as part of Denmark. He doesn't see Venezuela as sovereign. He doesn't see Panama as sovereign. He doesn't see the Americas as anything other than an extension of American U.S. Power. And it's not limited to the Americas. He views the Middle East certainly the same way. And I think the ultimate aspiration of the American deep state is somehow, though it's impossible, but somehow to hold on to the global hegemonic aspirations.
I wanted to show you, Professor Sachs, something that hasn't been talked about a lot, and that is the media's role, and the mainstream media's role in fueling this war on Venezuela. Semaphore, the intelligence community, is one of their mouthpieces of the deep state. They released this. Semaphore said that the New York Times and the Washington Post learned of a secret U.S. raid on Venezuela soon before it was scheduled to begin Friday night, but held off publishing what they knew to avoid endangering U.S. troops. Two people familiar with the communications between the administration and the news organizations said. What's your assessment of this in terms of the media's role with the deep state? It seems like they knew what was going on and decided not to publish.
I wouldn't go after this so much because the media generally don't publish operational details in the midst of an operation, whether the operation is illegal or not illegal. But what I would say about the New York Times is that it did not editorialize about this coming war, as far as I know, at all before the attack. I was, I would say, pleasantly a bit surprised that it made an editorial afterwards that said that this attack was illegal. But beforehand, quiet. I think it ran maybe 2 op-eds, one in favor, one against. Nothing from the editorial board. No warnings or explanations to the public of what would be a brazen and unconstitutional and dangerous and illegal attack. So anyway, the mainstream media, it's pathetic. So it's no surprise here, almost unreadable. The Washington Post is a megaphone for the CIA. The New York Times is almost useless in really trying to understand anything. But no surprise, this is not anything new.
Yes, I think the Washington Post, there were 2 op-eds, one in the New York Times that was against what had happened in Venezuela. Then there was one in the Washington Post that said something to the effect of, we should be happy that Maduro is gone. Of course, this is great for Venezuela, Venezuelan people, the world. And also Maduro is in a lot better shape. He's going to be in a humane prison, I think they said. So this is the extent of the kind of coverage we get. But Professor Sachs, you know, in the last few minutes that I have with you, I wanted to ask you about the larger world picture now with regard to Venezuela, because you know, Venezuela now is under fire from the United States. Trump is threatening a possible second strike should things not go his way. There's also protests in Iran, which Donald Trump has said were locked and loaded. The United States is, should Iran go too far in supposedly suppressing them. Israel is clamoring for war with Iran with the help of the United States. And of course, we still have the Ukraine conflict, which is raging, and the Trump administration doesn't appear to be too interested in coming to a settlement that Russia will actually agree upon. How do you make sense of this overall global picture now that the U.S. has expanded its theater to an even greater extent into Latin America, vis-a-vis Venezuela, now maybe Colombia, Cuba, Mexico? I mean, the list goes on and on.
Yes, I think we will have expanding war. I don't think the story in Venezuela is over. And Venezuela itself could become very complicated and hot and conflictual in the coming days. So that is one immediate point. But when Trump threatens war in a half a dozen countries, and especially when he meets with a war criminal, Netanyahu, and says that the United States understands and supports Netanyahu's position vis-a-vis Iran, I think you can unfortunately have a pretty high sense, a high likelihood that there will be war with Iran soon. That will be, if it happens, vastly more dangerous even than what's happening now in the Americas, because that is in the most explosive zone in the world, and it is an area where the great powers can easily clash, and where the escalation, even to nuclear war, becomes possible. So without making forecasts, I would say that the belligerency of Trump's words in recent days is not subtle. And it is likely to reflect what is an ongoing CIA and military preparation for further war. Trump told us the war with Venezuela is coming. We saw it. It was pretty clear that something was going to happen. Something's happened. It's pretty clear, I think, that this is not the end of the story there. And Trump is basically telling us there's more to come.
To what consequence then for the Trump administration, for the United States? To what consequence will all of this bring?
Well, I think this makes the world vastly more dangerous. The lawlessness, the attempt to destroy the United Nations and international law as a functioning part of global society and global geopolitics is very, very dangerous. And we don't really see a cessation of that. And Trump's rhetoric is the crudest we've ever had of an American president, I would guess. I can't vouch for every word that James Polk said. He was an expansionist, and we had other imperialists, but Trump's vulgarity in this regard is absolutely brazen, and his impulsivity is extremely high. And the point is not Trump's impulsivity. The point for me is that the military state of the United States is always revved for war. It's the job of a president to keep a foot on the brake. There is no foot on the brake right now. And that, to my mind, is extremely worrisome.
Venezuela. How does this operation affect your relationships with them?
Well, in terms of China and Russia, well, Russia when we get things straightened out. But in terms of other countries that want oil, we're in the oil business. We're going to sell it to them. We're not going to say we're not going to give it.
Wait, what? We're going to sell the oil to Russia and China? The regime change operation is fast underway in Venezuela. You can choose to support it. You can choose to oppose it. That is up to you. But what I'm here to do is tell you the facts that nobody else wants you to know. Because let's face it, they want this to be a straightforward, simple narrative, which is that one, we're doing this because we're liberating the Venezuelan people from an evil dictator. And two, we should have their oil, not China or Russia. Take a listen to Marco Rubio here.
If the purpose of the operation was to capture Maduro and bring him to justice, why does the United States need to take over the Venezuelan oil industry?
Well, we don't need to. First of all, let me go back up. We don't need Venezuela's oil. We have plenty of oil in the United States. What we're not going to allow is for the oil industry in Venezuela to be controlled by adversaries of the United States. You have to understand, why does China need their oil? Why does Russia need their oil? Why does Iran need their oil? They're not even in this continent. This is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be a base of operation for adversaries, competitors, and rivals of the United States.
Have specific oil companies?
We also want to see that oil and the proceeds from it. Hold on. We want to see the oil proceeds of that country benefit the people of Venezuela. Why have 8 million people left Venezuela? 8 million, the single largest mass migration probably in modern history, left Venezuela since 2014 because all the wealth of that country was stolen to the benefit of Maduro and his cronies in the regime, but not to the benefit of people of Venezuela. You know how destabilizing 8 million migrants is? The number one fear that Brazil has, that Colombia has, that all these countries in the region have about what's happening in Venezuela and our involvement is they're afraid of another mass migration event. That's what they fear. This is deeply destabilizing stuff. It's not going to continue to happen. They are not going to come from outside of our hemisphere, destabilize our region, in our own backyard, and us have to pay the price for it, not under President Trump.
Okay, Marco Rubio says we're going to keep Russia and China from getting this oil because it is in our backyard, it is in our best interests, and we should be the ones to control it. Except most of what he's saying there, if not all of it, is a complete lie, because the reality is actually much more complicated and also much more sinister, which I'll show you. But before I get into all of that, I need to address something, which is this idea that Venezuelans are so happy about this, so shut up. That, my friend, is completely manufactured regime change propaganda. Straight up. World's greatest independent journalist Nick Shirley is claiming right now that World Cup style celebrations are erupting all across Venezuela at the moment. Congratulations to all the people of Venezuela. Que Dios te bendiga. Except, oh no, wait a minute. That video is from Miami, Florida. Other accounts like Wall Street Apes are posting that Venezuelans are, quote, crying on their knees, thanking Trump and America for freeing them from Nicolas Maduro. Except the video is just 100% entirely AI slop. This is happening across a bunch of massive accounts all across social media. So my question is, if Venezuelans were actually happy about their leader getting abducted, we probably wouldn't need to rely on AI slop videos to do propaganda, right? And the point really isn't even about if there are celebrations or not, because on any issue, you're gonna find people who support it and you're gonna find people who oppose it. I mean, look at all these happy Iraqis from 2003.
There it goes.
And we all know how that turned out, right? Much, much worse. And you know who agrees with me? Donald Trump.
The world would be better off with Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi in power.
100%. Now, as far as Assad is concerned,
What about the human rights abuses?
Let's talk. Well, you don't think they're happening now? They're worse now than they ever were. People are getting their heads chopped off. They're being drowned. They're right now. They're far worse than they were ever under Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi. And it all blew up around Hillary Clinton and around Barack Obama. It all blew up. Now, one thing about Assad, not a good guy. I understand that. We have to rebuild our country. Our country's falling to pieces. We have 19 trillion in debt. We have infrastructure that's a disaster. Our roadways, our airports, our schools, everything. We have to start thinking about ourselves. We're pouring trillions of dollars into the Middle East, and we have nothing for it. We have nothing.
So what changed his mind? Because nobody's saying that Maduro is a good guy, or at least that's not what I've been saying, right? This is one of those situations where I think more than one thing can be true at the same time. Think about it this way. If Trump were to get abducted today, I guarantee you that there will be people in the streets celebrating, but it doesn't make it right. And the bigger point that almost nobody's talking about is the money, right? Follow the money. Where is this money going to go? Because we know that Trump wants Venezuela for its oil, but who is he giving that oil money to? Check this out. Venezuela raid enriches MAGA billionaire. The ouster of Maduro is a financial windfall for a prominent Trump-supporting billionaire investor, Paul Singer. What's his involvement with Venezuelan oil? Okay, it says here, in November 2025, Singer acquired Citgo, the U.S.-based subsidiary of Venezuela's state-run oil company. Singer, through his private investment firm Elliott Investment Management, bought Citgo for $5.9 billion. The sale of Amber Energy, a subsidiary of Elliott Investment Management, was forced by creditors of Venezuela after the country defaulted on its bond payments. In remarks to Fox News on Saturday, Trump made clear that one of the motivations for Saturday's attack was to increase the production and export of Venezuelan oil. Venezuela has the largest proven reserves of crude oil in the world. Trump said that moving forward, the U.S. would be, quote, very strongly involved with the Venezuelan oil industry. Industry observers anticipate a rapid rerouting of Venezuelan oil exports, reestablishing the U.S. as the major buyer of the country's volumes. Jaime Brito, an oil analyst at OPIS, said access to Venezuelan oil exports will, quote, be a game changer for U.S. Gulf Coast refiners in terms of profitability. Paul Singer, thanks to a well-timed transaction, will be one of the largest beneficiaries. And the question that I have, of course, is who the hell is Paul Singer? Well, it looks like Paul Singer is a prominent American financier and philanthropist known for his strong support of Israel and Zionist causes. Singer and the Paul E. Singer Family Foundation are behind the Philos Project, a pro-Israel Christian organization. In 2016, Singer partnered with the Museum of the Bible to fund Passages Israel, a program to take college students to Israel. He is a, quote, longtime supporter of hawkish pro-Israel causes. So ultimately, all of this oil money that we're about to get our hands on isn't going to make the lives of the average American better. It's not going to go into their hands. It's going to go to people who are loyal to the state of Israel and their chosen agenda. Don't believe me? Well, evidently this Paul Singer guy has already moved and outsourced a bunch of US tech jobs to Israel. Thank you so much for Whitney Webb's wonderful reporting there. And speaking of oil and how it relates to our national interests, so much of the conversation has been focused on how this will be good for America, good for Americans, bad for China, bad for Russia. But I'm not even sure if this is true. For example, Matt Walsh of the Daily Wire writes, quote, "This is a war for oil." First off, the war lasted like 90 minutes. Well, 90 minutes so far. As we see in all these things, mission accomplished does not necessarily mean mission accomplished. Okay. And he says, second, going to war to secure vital resources for your own people is totally legitimate. Why should we allow some third world communist shithole to control trillions of dollars worth of oil? Well, okay then, Matt, we should probably keep China and Russia from getting access to this oil, right? To make sure that we starve them of these precious national or natural resources, right? No, evidently wrong.
China, Russia, and Iran have interests in Venezuela. How does this operation affect your relationships with them when
Well,
it
in
comes
terms
to the
of
oil and
China
drugs?
and Russia, well, Russia, when we get things straightened out. But in terms of other countries that want oil, we're in the oil business. We're going to sell it to them. We're not going to say we're not going to give it to them. In other words, we'll be selling oil probably in much larger doses because they couldn't produce very much because their infrastructure was so bad. So we'll be selling large amounts of oil to other countries.
So wait a second. We're going to do a regime change in Venezuela to make sure we keep the bad guys out, to make sure China and Russia don't get their oil because, right, they are the bad guys and we are the good guys. But we're still going to sell the oil to the bad guys? What the hell is going on here? And that's honestly the ugly truth that nobody wants to tell you, that none of this will benefit anybody anywhere other than the elites and the people who control the game. Okay, the Venezuelan people are going to suffer because regime change is deadly for regular people on the ground. That's just how things like this go. You know, just ask Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan or Vietnam or Cambodia or Chile or whoever else. I can go on. And the American people, we're not going to see any of this money. It's going to go to, like we talked about, the Zionist billionaires and the oil companies. And in fact, we probably have to spend more money to pay for this fiasco because all of the tax money that we're going to spend on this is not going to be used for domestic infrastructure projects. It's not going to be used for healthcare or education. It's going to be used to fund military operations and wars around the world. Okay, because apparently we're not done. Okay, just in the couple of days since we've attacked Venezuela, Trump is now threatening to take over Colombia, Cuba, Greenland, Iran, and Mexico. And to pay for all that, the Federal Reserve, what is it going to have to do? It's going to have to print more money, which will further devalue our dollar. It's going to cause more inflation. All the while, China and Russia evidently will still have unfettered access to all the natural resources they want, albeit through a Zionist billionaire. So please don't let them play you for a fool. Okay, if we're seizing the oil only to sell it to our enemies in Moscow and Beijing, how is this an American victory? And to go back, so to speak, it honestly looks a lot like a globalist heist designed to drain yours and I's wallet and funnel all this wealth to the same international banking families and Zionist interests that have been dragging us into these foreign wars for decades. But hey, that's just me. That's just what I think. Let me know what you think. Do you support regime change in Venezuela? And will this make America stronger or weaker? Sound off in the comments.
As we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in. So we're going to stay until such time as we're going to run it essentially until such time as a proper transition can take place. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money. We're in the oil business. We're going to sell it to them. We're not going to say we're not going to give it. In other words, we'll be selling oil.
The United States has been attacking Venezuela and intervening in its internal affairs for more than 25 years. In fact, in 2002, the US government backed a military coup that briefly ousted Venezuela's democratically elected left-wing president, Hugo Chavez, who came to power through elections in 1998. And ever since he won those elections, the US tried to overthrow him, although it did fail at that point. In the following years, the US government backed many other coup attempts in Venezuela, and the US hit Venezuela with aggressive sanctions in violation of international law, trying to destroy its economy. And in 2019, during his first administration, Donald Trump launched another coup attempt in Venezuela when the US recognized a little-known right-wing opposition politician named Juan Guaido as the supposed interim president of Venezuela. Now, that coup attempt also failed. So this is why in his second term, Donald Trump went to a whole new extreme level and he directly waged war against Venezuela. He bombed the country, and then the US government kidnapped the internationally recognized constitutional president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. The United States abducted this foreign leader and then sent him to the US to be tried on politically motivated bogus charges in a US show trial. This is blatant imperialism. There's no other word for it. And this has nothing to do with accusations of supposed drug trafficking or any rhetoric about democracy or human rights or any of that propaganda. That's all a distraction. Because after Trump bombed Venezuela and kidnapped its president, he gave a press conference in which he admitted that this is actually about stealing Venezuela's oil so US corporations can profit.
We're going to be taking out a tremendous amount of wealth out of the ground. We're in the oil business. We're going to sell it to them. We're not going to say we're not going to give it. In other words, we'll be selling oil. We built Venezuela oil industry with American talent, drive, and skill, and the socialist regime stole it from us.
And he declared that the US empire is imposing its dominance in the entire region. Trump invoked the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine and claimed that all of Latin America is part of the US imperial sphere of influence.
And the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot. They now call it the Monroe Doctrine.
And then in the craziest moment of all, Trump said that the goal is for the US to run Venezuela, to govern the country. The US government is treating Venezuela like a colony, like 19th century style European colonialism.
The people that are standing right behind me, we're going to be running it. We're going to be running it with a group, and we're going to make sure it's run properly. We're going to rebuild the oil infrastructure. We're going to run the country right. It's going to be run very judiciously, very fairly. It's going to make a lot of money.
So Trump actually admitted what critics of the constant US attacks on Venezuela have been saying for many years, that the real goal of the US government was to steal Venezuela's natural resources so US corporations can exploit them. It's not a coincidence that Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. And US corporations have been desperately trying to get access to that oil to exploit Venezuela's oil ever since it was fully nationalized by the left-wing president, Hugo Chavez. And Trump made it as clear as day that this is one of the main reasons for this colonial war on Venezuela and US occupation of Venezuela. So today I'm going to go through some of the most important moments from this press conference that the Trump administration gave just a few hours after it bombed Venezuela and kidnapped its internationally recognized president on the 3rd of January. Trump said that the US government is going to run Venezuela like a colony. And then a journalist asked, who is going to run Venezuela? And Trump said, the people standing behind me, referring to the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth. And then he also said that the US government is going to appoint people as representatives. So this has nothing to do with democracy. Again, the US government does not want the people of Venezuela to actually have their sovereignty. The US is treating this independent country as a colony. Listen here.
Would run Venezuela.
Well, it's largely going to be for a period of time, the people that are standing right behind me. We're going to be running it. We're going to be bringing it back. It's a dead, I talk about a dead country.
Mechanism by which you're going to run the country? Are you going to designate a U.S. official
Yes,
to
yes,
coordinate?
it's all being done right now. We're designating people. We're talking to people. We're designating various people, and we're going to let you know who those people are. We're going to be running it with a group, and we're going to make sure it's run properly. We're going to rebuild the oil infrastructure.
And then after that, in one of the craziest moments of the press conference, a journalist asked Trump if the US government will be running Venezuela for several years. And Trump basically said yes. He didn't directly answer the question, but he implied that yes, the goal is for the US government to run Venezuela as a colony for years until there's a transition to a pro-US leadership. And in the meantime, Trump defended this colonial occupation by saying, don't worry, we're going to pay for it by exploiting Venezuela's oil. He boasted that US corporations are going to invest in modernizing Venezuela's infrastructure, and they're going to use that oil in order to fund the colonial US occupation of the country. This is absolutely crazy. Listen here.
Mr. President, is it possible that the U.S. ends up administrating Venezuela for years?
Well, it won't cost us anything because the money coming out of the ground is very substantial. So it's not going to cost us anything. We want safety there. We want to be surrounded by countries that aren't housing all of our enemies all over the world. That was happening, and you don't want to have that. But we're going to be rebuilding, and we're not spending money. The oil companies are going to go in. They're going to spend money. We're going to take back the oil that, frankly, we should have taken back a long time ago. A lot of money is coming out of the ground. We're going to get reimbursed for all of that. We're going to get reimbursed for everything that we spend. So it's going to be a very important. This is a very big evening that took place last night. We have to be surrounded by safe, secure countries. And we also have to have energy. Very important. We have to have energy.
In addition to that, another reporter asked Trump if he plans on deploying US troops inside Venezuela in order to oversee this colonial occupation. And once again, Trump basically said yes. He said, yeah, we're not afraid of deploying US troops on Venezuela. He boasted that they already had troops on the ground in Venezuela.
President, does the U.S. running the country mean that U.S. troops will be on the ground? How will that work?
Well, they always say boots on the ground. So we're not afraid of boots on the ground if we have to have. We had boots on the ground last night at a very high level, actually. We're not afraid of it. We don't mind saying it. But we're going to make sure that country is run properly. We're not doing this in vain.
In a follow-up question, a reporter then asked Trump for more details about the plans for U.S. troops on the ground. And Trump said, well, we're going to send oil technicians from big corporations to go to Venezuela in order to exploit its oil and make lots of money.
You referenced boots on the ground earlier. Can you just sort of button this up? Do you envision the U.S. military having a presence in Venezuela as the U.S. runs that?
Well, no, we're going to have a presence in Venezuela as it pertains to oil because we have to have. We're sending our expertise in. So you may need something, not very much. But no, we're going to be taking out a tremendous amount of wealth out of the ground. And that wealth is going to the people of Venezuela and people from outside of Venezuela that used to be in Venezuela. And it goes also to the United States of America in the form of reimbursement for the damages caused us by that country.
This was a point that Trump constantly emphasized throughout the press conference. At the beginning, he spent like a few minutes pretending that this was about drugs. But then later, he showed that was a lie. This has nothing to do with drugs. This is about pillaging Venezuela. And by the way, it's not just oil that the US wants to pillage in Venezuela. The country also has significant reserves of natural gas and gold and critical minerals and rare earth elements. And the Trump administration has been very open about the fact that it plans on sending US corporations to exploit all of these natural resources. In fact, just a few hours after Trump kidnapped Venezuela's president, the Wall Street Journal reported that vultures on Wall Street are already planning on joining in the pillage of Venezuela. This report in the Wall Street Journal noted that officials from top hedge funds and asset managers are sending representatives to Venezuela to meet with the new US puppet regime, including top ministers, the head of the central bank, and the Caracas Stock Exchange head. And the Trump administration has been very open about the fact that they want to carry out mass privatizations and sell off all of Venezuela's assets to US investors for pennies on the dollar, like what the US did to Russia in the 1990s after the overthrow of the Soviet Union that led to the creation of these oligarchs who bought up the privatized assets in a fire sale, which was obviously extremely corrupt. This is what the US and Wall Street are now trying to repeat in Venezuela. In another very revealing moment in this press conference, Trump admitted that his war in Venezuela is not actually about these fake accusations of so-called drug trafficking. Instead, he complained that Venezuela stole our oil, he claimed. Now, Venezuela did not steal any foreigners' oil. This is oil that belongs to the country of Venezuela, to the people of Venezuela. Venezuela's democratically elected left-wing president, Hugo Chavez, passed a law that was very popular in the country that said that all foreign companies that had invested in Venezuela's oil industry had to accept minority stakes in joint ventures in oil projects that were majority owned by Venezuela's state-owned oil company, PDVSA. And many of these Western oil corporations would not accept those terms because they wanted to make much more money. They wanted to maximize their profits. So they decided to leave Venezuela. As the UK's major newspaper, The Guardian, reported when this happened back in 2007, it noted that US corporations like ConocoPhillips, Chevron, and ExxonMobil, along with European corporations like BP, they, quote, agreed to transfer operational control to state-owned Petróleos de Venezuela, end quote. And that is PDVSA, the state-owned oil company. But Trump claims this is a theft of US property, even though it's Venezuelan property. And he says this is one of the main reasons why he bombed Venezuela and abducted President Maduro.
You know, they stole our oil. We built that whole industry there, and they just took it over like we were nothing. And we had a president that decided not to do anything about it. So we did something about it. We're late, but we did something about it. Yep. In addition, Venezuela unilaterally seized and stole American oil, American assets, and American platforms, costing us billions and billions of dollars. They did this a while ago, but we never had a president that did anything about it. They took all of our property. It was our property.
And as if that weren't already crazy enough, Trump then showed how he's acting like an imperial mafia boss, and he threatened all of the other Venezuelan government officials. And he said that if they refuse to allow the US to create a colonial occupation to steal Venezuela's oil, he said that the US military will attack Venezuela again and hit the country even harder this time.
And we are ready to stage a second and much larger attack if we need to do so. So we were prepared to do a second wave. The first attack was so successful, we probably don't have to do a second, but we're prepared to do a second wave, a much bigger wave, actually.
By the way, the New York Times reported that at least 40 Venezuelans were killed in this U.S. bombing of Venezuela, of multiple cities, not just the capital, Caracas, on the 3rd of January. And among those killed were Venezuelan civilians. And Trump is now threatening to attack again to kill more Venezuelans to steal their oil. And Trump threatened political and military officials in the Venezuelan government and said if they don't go along with what the U.S. empire wants as colonial vassals, then the U.S. will kidnap them just like it kidnapped President Maduro.
Very importantly, the embargo on all Venezuelan oil remains in full effect. The American armada remains poised in position, and the United States retains all military options until United States demands have been fully met and fully satisfied. All political and military figures in Venezuela should understand what happened to Maduro can happen to them, and it will happen to them.
And by the way, on the subject of drug trafficking, it's obvious that the US government does not actually care about drug trafficking because Donald Trump just pardoned and released from prison one of the world's worst drug traffickers, the former US-backed dictator of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez. And Trump was actually asked about this in the press conference. A reporter said, wait, you claim to care about supposed drug trafficking in Venezuela, which is fake, by the way. The US government fabricated that to justify this colonial war of aggression. And he said, if you really care about this, why did you release this drug trafficker? And Trump's response was, well, I like this guy. He's a right-wing politician. He essentially said he's our drug trafficker. He's the US empire's drug trafficker. And he claimed that this former dictator of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was a victim of political persecution. Listen here.
You said that Maduro is responsible for drug trafficking. You recently pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was convicted on many drug trafficking. Can you explain how these two situations are?
Well, I endorsed, as you know, the winning president, the man who won in Honduras. I endorsed the man who won in Chile. I endorsed the man who won in Argentina. And we are doing very well with that whole group. What the man that I pardoned was, if you could equate it to us, he was treated like the Biden administration treated a man named Trump. That didn't work out too well for them. This was a man who was persecuted very unfairly. He was the head of the country. He was persecuted very unfairly. And there are a number of them. And we felt that it was a very unfair situation that happened to him. He's also a party member of the man who won.
By the way, on the subject of the US government's extreme hypocrisy in regard to drug trafficking, the journalist and US military veteran Seth Harp pointed out that the US Special Operations Forces that kidnapped President Maduro were Delta Force. And Seth Harp, who again is not only a journalist, but a military veteran, he published a book that has been very popular and has won awards. It's called The Fort Bragg Cartel. And he details how the US government and especially US Special Operations Forces are deeply involved in drug trafficking. So he wrote that you can bet that the only narcotics involved in this US war in Venezuela were the ones that US Special Operations Forces were on when they were kidnapping the internationally recognized constitutional president of Venezuela. The hypocrisy just never ends when we're talking about the US empire. The hypocrisy is mind-blowing. In this press conference, Donald Trump also made it clear that the US war on Venezuela is part of a larger attack on all of Latin America. Trump proudly declared that the US empire is imposing its dominance in the entire region, and the US plans to control all of the natural resources in the region. Listen to this blatantly imperialist rhetoric here.
We are reasserting American power in a very powerful way. In our home region, we had great dominance in my first term, and we have far greater dominance right now. Everyone's coming back to us. The future will be determined by the ability to protect commerce and territory and resources that are core to national security. These are core to our national security, just like tariffs are.
Trump also invoked the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine, which he updated, calling it the so-called Donroe Doctrine. And he essentially said that the U.S. empire sees all of Latin America as part of its imperial sphere of influence, as its imperial backyard. And he said that Latin America is not allowed to have its own foreign policy. And in particular, he complained about Venezuela's partnership with so-called foreign adversaries, which is another way of saying Venezuela's partnership with China, Russia, and Iran. So Trump is now sending a message to the entire region. You cannot have close ties with China, Russia, and Iran, or the U.S. is going to attack you and try to overthrow your government.
Furthermore, under the now deposed dictator Maduro, Venezuela was increasingly hosting foreign adversaries in our region. All of these actions were in gross violation of the core principles of American foreign policy, dating back more than 2 centuries, and not anymore. All the way back, it dated to the Monroe Doctrines. And the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot. They now call it the Monroe Document. I don't know. It's Monroe Doctrine. We sort of forgot about it. It was very important, but we forgot about it. We don't forget about it anymore. Under our new national security strategy, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. Won't happen.
It's obvious that the U.S. war in Venezuela is also part of the new Cold War that the United States is waging against China. China is an important partner of Venezuela. China, by the way, imported 80% of Venezuela's oil. And top allies of Donald Trump and the Republican Party have said very clearly that they see the war in Venezuela as part of the second Cold War against China. By the way, just a few hours before Trump bombed Venezuela and kidnapped President Maduro, he actually had a meeting with China's diplomatic envoy, a special representative who was physically in Caracas at the presidential palace a few hours before the U.S. bombed it. So, I mean, it's so clear that the U.S. is also targeting China. For instance, the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a close ally and a sycophant of Trump, he stated very openly in a tweet that this is a message to China, that China should cut its ties with Venezuela and Russia and Iran. And he said, quote, "It's time they paid a price," end quote, referring to China. So once again, this is a top U.S. government official and ally of the president saying very openly that they are trying to isolate and contain China in Cold War II. And this is just an aside, but what was funny is after Lindsey Graham tweeted out these threats against China, someone on Twitter asked Grok, they said, "How many nations has the U.S. bombed over the last 50 years compared to China?" And Grok pointed out in a conservative estimate that the U.S. has bombed between 14 and 16 countries since 1976, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Pakistan, Sudan, Serbia, Iran, Lebanon, Grenada, Panama, and Bosnia. You can now also add Venezuela and Nigeria to that. Trump, in his second term, has now bombed Nigeria and Venezuela. And Grok pointed out that China has not conducted any known bombing operations in foreign countries during this same period. So it's obvious to the entire world that the U.S. empire is an insane warmonger that is threatening the entire planet with chaos to overthrow any independent governments it doesn't like so U.S. corporations can exploit them. I mean, this is just blatant imperialism. But what's clear is that this U.S. war in Venezuela, again, is not only aimed at Venezuela and it's not only aimed at China and Russia and Iran. It is especially aimed at other countries in Latin America, especially if they have independent left-wing governments. So, for instance, Cuba is now likely going to be the next target of the U.S. empire. And Lindsey Graham, this Republican senator and Trump ally, he wrote very clearly that the leaders of Cuba should leave the country and leave power because the Trump administration plans on attacking them. Lindsey Graham claimed that the so-called liberation of Cuba is near. He said, "Free Cuba, long live the Monroe Doctrine." Again, this is just blatant imperialism. These U.S. politicians are saying that the U.S. empire should control all of the countries of Latin America. And it wasn't just Lindsey Graham who said this. Donald Trump and his warmongering Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, also talked about Cuba in this press conference after they boasted of bombing Venezuela. Trump directly threatened Cuba, and then he passed the word over to Marco Rubio. And Rubio also said that the leaders of the government in Cuba's capital, La Habana, should be scared. This is a direct threat to attack the Cuban government right after the U.S. attacked the Venezuelan government. I mean, these are rabid dogs of imperialism. just lashing out and attacking any government they don't like. Listen here.
Is a message here for Cuba and U.S. Canal?
Well, Cuba's an interesting case. Cuba is, not doing very well right now. That system has not been a very good one for Cuba. The people there have suffered for many, many years. And I think Cuba is going to be something we'll end up talking about because Cuba is a failing nation right now, very badly failing nation. And we want to help the people. It's very similar in the sense that we want to help the people in Cuba, but we want to also help the people that were forced out of Cuba and living in this country. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, look, if I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned, at least a little bit.
And then after Trump and Rubio threatened Cuba, they also threatened Colombia's left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, who, by the way, was democratically elected. He has only served one term, and he's stepping down after because Colombia only allows presidents to serve one term. And yet Trump claims he's a so-called dictator, and Trump directly threatened him and said that Colombia's elected president should watch his ass. Listen to this blatant threat. I mean, this is a mafia leader who's the head of the most powerful empire on earth right now.
Mr. President, Colombian President Gustavo Petro, a couple weeks ago, he said he's got to watch his ass.
And yeah, I think I stick by my first statement. He does have to watch his ass.
And by the way, this is not just rhetoric. The Trump administration already imposed illegal unilateral sanctions on the sitting president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, which is a blatant act of aggression, violating Colombia's sovereignty and also meddling in the internal affairs of this country, where, by the way, an election is coming up in Colombia in May of 2026. And the Trump administration has made it clear that they're going to try to meddle in that election to put in power a right-wing U.S. puppet, just like they're doing all across Latin America. Once again, this is blatant imperialism. This is the colonial Monroe Doctrine in the 21st century. In fact, during this press conference that the Trump administration gave after bombing Venezuela, another official who spoke was Trump's war secretary, Pete Hegseth, the head of the Pentagon, which he proudly renamed from the Department of Defense to the Department of War, which is a much more accurate name, by the way. These are just insane warmongers who are just attacking countries all around the world. And in this press conference, Pete Hegseth threatened U.S. adversaries, and he boasted that the U.S. will project our will anywhere we want in the world. And he talked about the long arm of the U.S. empire, which can attack any country it wants. Listen to the insane warmongering imperialist rhetoric of this guy who's now the U.S. Secretary of War.
As the president said, our adversaries remain on notice. America can project our will anywhere, anytime. The coordination, the stealth, the lethality, the precision, the very long arm of American justice, all on full display in the middle of the night. Nicolas Maduro had his chance, just like Iran had their chance, until they didn't and until he didn't. He effed around and he found out.
Note how he not only boasted about bombing Venezuela, but also about bombing Iran. And then he said very clearly that the U.S. wants to take over Venezuela's oil and impose U.S. dominance in the region.
Deadly serious about getting back the oil that was stolen from us, and deadly serious about reestablishing American deterrence and dominance in the Western Hemisphere.
And then finally, this warmongering, proud, self-declared Secretary of War referred to this as peace through strength. He claims that the U.S. is advancing peace by bombing countries, kidnapping their presidents, and stealing their natural resources.
This is America first. This is peace through strength. And the United States War Department is proud to help deliver it. Welcome to 2026. And under President Trump, America is back.
Continuing in this press conference, Trump then gave the platform to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the top U.S. military official. His name is Dan Kane. He's also popularly known as Raisin Kane because he likes to raze to the ground all of the countries that are bombed by the U.S. like a medieval barbarian. And he boasted that the U.S. empire will deliver overwhelming force against any foe anywhere in the world. Again, they still see the US as the dictator of planet Earth. They still think we're in the unipolar era of the 1990s, and the US empire controls every corner of the planet, and they're threatening the entire world. Listen here.
Our jobs are to integrate combat power so when the order comes, we can deliver overwhelming force at the time and the place of our choosing against any foe anywhere in the world.
Then we saw one of the most Orwellian moments of this press conference, where this top US military official claimed that the US military was acting in self-defense by bombing Venezuelan targets because 150 US aircrafts violated Venezuela's airspace, invading Venezuela, and then some Venezuelan military forces responded to the US attack on their country. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this top US military official, claimed that the US was acting in self-defense. He claimed that 2 times. Listen to this insane Orwellian rhetoric where this US war criminal claims that while he's attacking another country, the US was acting in self-defense.
On arrival into the target area, the helicopters came under fire, and they replied with that fire with overwhelming force in self-defense. One of our aircraft was hit, but remained flyable. There were multiple self-defense engagements as the force began to withdraw out of Venezuela.
By the way, this also led to one of the funniest moments in this press conference. It was a major Freudian slip. Donald Trump was praising this war criminal, the General Raisin Cain, and Trump congratulated him for carrying out, quote, one of the most precise attacks on sovereignty, end quote. He was subconsciously admitting that the US government was attacking Venezuela's sovereignty.
But this guy is fantastic. I watched last night one of the most precise attacks on sovereignty. I mean, it was an attack for justice.
And then finally, the other speaker in this press conference after the US bombed Venezuela was Marco Rubio, who simultaneously serving as both the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. Rubio has dedicated his entire career to destabilizing the left-wing governments in Latin America. So he was one of the main architects of this war in Venezuela. And now he's also threatening Cuba and Nicaragua and the left-wing governments in Brazil and Colombia and Mexico. And in this press conference, Rubio basically said that foreign leaders are not allowed to have an independent foreign policy. He complained that Maduro and Venezuela had good relations with Iran and they exercised national control over their own natural resources. And Rubio said, you're not allowed to do this. The US government is the dictator of the entire world. We control you. And if you don't listen to us, we will kidnap you.
The other message here is the following. You have a guy, like many people around the world, they like to play games. You have a guy who decides he's going to invite Iran into his country, is going to, do the confiscation of American oil companies, basically likes to play games all this time and thinks nothing's going to happen. And I hope what people now understand is that we have a president. The 47th president of the United States is not a game player. When he tells you that he's going to do something, when tells you he's going to address a problem, he means it. He actions it.
Rubio then went on and he claimed that Maduro was acting as a wild man and supposedly he was crazy because the US government threatened him and told him, you have to step down from power. And if you don't, we're going to bomb your country. And Maduro said, no, I am the constitutional president of my country. The US is not the dictator of planet Earth. You can't decide who foreign leaders are. And Rubio said, this is why Maduro was supposedly bad, is because he did not agree to step down after the US government told him, we don't like you. You can't be the leader of a foreign country. Think about the implications of this. What the US is telling to the entire world is that the US empire believes it has the right to decide who should be the leader of every country on earth. And if it doesn't like them, then it can kidnap them and bomb their country. This is absolutely crazy. Listen here.
There's a president of peace, by the way. I told you what I just said earlier. This guy had multiple opportunities to find his way somewhere else and figure out another. He could have been living somewhere else right now, very happy, but instead he wanted to play big boy. And so now, he's got other sets of problems on his hands. But I want to be clear about one thing. Nicolas Maduro had multiple opportunities to avoid this. He was provided multiple very, very, very generous offers and chose instead to act like a wild man, chose instead to play around. And the result is what we saw tonight.
And in that clip there, once again, you can hear this Orwellian rhetoric where Marco Rubio claimed that Donald Trump is the president of peace. Trump has now bombed 10 countries. In addition to just bombing Venezuela, Trump also recently bombed Nigeria and Somalia and Iran. Throughout this press conference, multiple times, Trump and the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, who renamed the Pentagon the Department of War, they repeatedly boasted of also bombing Iran. And yet they claim that they are supporting peace. This is completely Orwellian. We live in an absolutely insane world where the most violent warmongering empire on earth is just constantly bombing foreign countries, carrying out coups, overthrowing independent governments, deciding who they think should be the leader of countries. And they claim that they're supporting peace and democracy and human rights. If you actually believe that, you must be living on Mars. You are not paying attention to what's actually happening here in reality. So here in the work that we do, I hope we can help to provide some of that larger context, because sometimes the Western corporate media just ignores this context and does not emphasize how crazy the situation is and how the US government is the biggest rogue regime on earth and the biggest threat to world peace. There's no other country that comes even remotely close. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank you all for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.
Kofi, follow me.